Greetings, traveler of the void. You have entered the domain of void-born terrors. Before we breach the first seal of this recovered chronicle, secure the Geller field by marking this transmission with your approval. The warp hungers for unshielded signals, and we have no wish to be devoured mid-broadcast. Join the crew by subscribing to our archive and strike the bell of notification so no future Vox Thief recording passes you by in the dark. For those who would offer a tithe to keep these forbidden archives burning, a YouTube gift shrine waits in the data below. Tribute is welcomed, never demanded. What follows is the first chapter of the Vox-Journal of Logister-Sergeant Veyl Dren, Cadian 114th Provisional, attached as escort to Mechanicus Exploratory Cohort Omega-Vryth. The data slate was recovered, drifting in the warp translation zone of the Ghoul Stars, by elements of the Imperial Navy frigate Sword of Remembrance. It has since been classified Vermillion-Obscura by the Ordo Xenos. This recording should not exist. It does anyway. Steel your humors, traveler. The descent begins now. Chapter 1. The Bone Grey Shore. Logister-Sergeant Veyl Dren, Cadian 114th Provisional, attached by writ of the Adeptus Administratum to Mechanicus Exploratory Cohort Omega-Vryth. Personal Vox-Journal, unsanctioned, maintained in violation of Article 33 of the Munitorum Code of Correspondence. I am aware of the penalty. Throne-bound flogging and reassignment to a penal legion. I have been in penal legions before. They are in truth more honest than what I ride with now. We translated out of the warp this morning's cycle. I say morning. There is no morning in the void. There is only the ship's arbitrary reckoning of hours, and the ship's reckoning is wrong. Every chrono aboard the Umbra Laudatum has been running slow for 3 rotations. The Magos says it is the proximity of the target system. The Confessor says nothing at all, which is worse. The Confessor has always had an opinion on everything, except the things I most need an opinion on. The translation itself was foul. I have ridden the warp 42 times in my service. I have felt the Geller field shudder under the pouring of things that wanted inside. I have heard the screams down the long corridors that every guardsman learns not to investigate. I have tasted the copper and ozone tang that marks a near breach and spat it back out and kept marching. I am not a stranger to bad translations. This one was worse. The Umbra Laudatum came out of the immaterium screaming. The hull itself. The plating along the dorsal spine emitted a harmonic keen for 17 seconds after we translated, as though the ship were a wounded beast and the warp had taken a bite out of it on the way through. The lumen strips in the troop deck blew their sanctified filaments in sequence from fore to aft, one after another, in a rhythm I did not like. A procession, a countdown. Something was counting us as we came aboard this reality. The air reeked of ozone so thick I could taste it on my molars. Beneath the ozone, the corpse starch rations in the mess hall had soured in their vacuum pouches. All of them, every crate, a full tithe cycle's worth of protein, turned to grey slurry in the span of a single warp translation. The Munitorum quartermasters were tearing their vestments and weeping. I do not blame them. A guardsman can endure many things. A guardsman does not endure the loss of his rations. Confessor Haust vomited sacramental wine into his censer during the translation. I watched him do it. He did not seem surprised. He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand and muttered something in a dialect of High Gothic I do not speak. And then he looked up at me, and he said very softly, in Low Gothic, so the tech priests would not hear him, "We are expected." I asked him what he meant. He did not answer. He has not answered since. The navigator was screaming. I want to put this down clearly because the ship's log does not. The ship's log says Navigator Primus Yavel Orlate reported nominal translation, no complications, retired to her sanctum for post-translation ablutions. The ship's log is a lie. I was on the bridge auxiliary during translation. I saw the pict feed from her sealed compartment go dark 1 second before we exited the warp, and I heard, we all heard, every soul on the auxiliary deck heard, the sound that came through the Vox pickup in the half-second before the feed cut. It was not a human scream. It was the shape of a human scream. It had the right duration. It had the right pitch. But it was composed of, I do not have the words for what it was composed of. Fragments, echoes, other voices, layered underneath the main voice, screaming in unison with her and not quite synchronized, so that the scream had a doubled and tripled quality, as though she was screaming in chorus with versions of herself that were a heartbeat ahead and a heartbeat behind. The pict feed came back online 4 minutes later. Navigator Orlight was sitting calmly in her sanctum throne, hands folded in her lap, the third eye beneath her warding band, twitching gently under the cloth. She answered the ship captain's hail in a level voice. She reported nominal translation. She retired to her quarters. I asked the Vox officer, an old Segmentum Pacificus rating named Threll, whether he had heard what I heard. He told me he had heard nothing. He would not look at me when he said it. I made a note in my journal. Standard procedure. Mark the anomaly. Mark the denial. A good logister keeps his records, whether or not the records will be believed. That is the whole point of being a logister. We are the ones who write down the things the administratum later pretends did not happen. I did not know then that the Umbra Laudatum's logs were already being rewritten faster than I could witness them. Kheth-Varnak. The world hangs in the forward viewport, like something seen through a dirty lens. I have seen 100 worlds from orbit, forge worlds, cloaked in the soot of their own foundries, agri-worlds green as the armor of the scions, death worlds bristling with the atmospheric bruises of their own ecosystems, trying to eat themselves, hive worlds glittering with the fires of 10 billion souls burning themselves down for the Emperor's promise. Kheth-Varnak is none of these. Kheth-Varnak is bone grey. The entire surface from pole to pole is the color of a long dead thing left in a dry place. Obsidian dunes blacker than pitch cut across the bone grey plains in arcing sweeps, as though something vast had once dragged its claws across the surface and left the scars to cool. Pylons. That is the only word the Mechanicus will permit me to use, though they are not pylons. They are teeth. They are fangs. They are the broken jawbones of something the size of a continent. Pylons rise from the wastes at intervals that are almost but not quite regular. A human architect, surveying the pattern, would feel a crawling sense that there is a geometry here. He is almost perceiving and cannot quite grasp. A Mechanicus cogitator, running the pattern, goes silent for longer than it should before confirming the coordinates. The sun is worse than the world. Kheth-Varnak's star is a swollen, sagging thing, the color of infected tallow. Adept Discipulus Veyl showed me the spectrographic readings. She was trying, I think, to reassure me. It is a perfectly normal late-sequence star, she said. Unremarkable. Well within the expected parameters for a system of this age. Her voice shook when she said it. The light from that sun falls on Kheth-Varnak in slow, curdled waves. It does not illuminate. It settles, like dust on a shrine that has not been tended in a long while. Standing on the observation gallery and watching the world turn beneath us, I had the very distinct sensation that the light from that sun was not touching the surface of the planet so much as it was being permitted to touch the surface of the planet, on sufferance, by something below. I recorded this observation in my journal. When I reviewed the entry an hour later, it had been subtly altered. The word permitted had been replaced with the word allowed. I did not make that change. The cogitator housing my journal is not networked. It should not be capable of being changed by any hand but mine. I made a note of the alteration. When I reviewed the note of the alteration, it had been deleted. I am writing this entry by hand now, on parchment, with a stylus. I do not trust the cogitator anymore. Planetfall was conducted in 2 lander barges. I rode in Lander Secundus with the bulk of the guardsman escort, my own squad, such as it is, plus 2 auxiliary fire teams from the Valhallan 12th, on loan from the garrison at Port Moore. Magos explorator Magos Ghrenn rode in Lander Primus with his Skitari honor guard, his servitor column, his sanctified excavation crates, and his personal cogitator throne. The Magos does not ride in the same vessel as men of unaugmented flesh. This is not a slight, this is simply protocol. He finds our breath distracting. Confessor Haust rode with us. He did not have to. He chose to. He sat across from me in the lander's crash webbing, his censer clutched in both hands, his lips moving in continuous silent prayer. He did not open his eyes for the entire descent. When a junior guardsman, Korik, the Voxman, young and nervous and newly tithed, asked the confessor for a blessing before landing, Haust opened his eyes, looked at Korik for a long moment, and then said very gently, "I have none left, child. They were all taken during translation. I am empty. I am sorry." Korik cried for most of the descent, quietly, into his helmet collar. I pretended not to notice. The other guardsman pretended not to notice. 6 Hecht, my corporal, the big Vostroyan who has been my second since the Kashan campaign, caught my eye across the webbing and made a small gesture with his 6-fingered left hand, the Cadian field sign for bad omen. I nodded and made a second sign back. We go anyway, because we always go anyway. That is what it is to be guardsmen. The orders come down from the administratum, and we go. If the orders are bad, we go. If the world is haunted, we go. If the Emperor is not listening on this particular frequency, in this particular sector of space, we still go, because the alternative is a la round through the base of the skull, administered by a commissar who has also stopped listening. So we went. The lander broke through the atmosphere at 31 kilometers and began its burn. The viewport clouded over with the chemical discharge of entry. Through the smeared obscura, I could make out, in fits and starts, the approach to our designated landing site. A valley between 3 of the largest pylons, each taller than a hive spire, each canted at an angle that suggested they had not been built so much as planted, driven into the crust of the world from above by some impossible hand. The Auspex readings coming through my helmet display were nonsense. The altimeter reported our altitude as 31 kilometers, then as 400 meters, then as 67 kilometers, then as 12 meters. The pilot servitor did not react to any of these readings. The pilot servitor had been set to dead reckoning from the moment we entered atmosphere, because the Magos had known in advance that the Auspex could not be trusted here. He had known. He had not told us. He had told the pilot servitor, who could not speak. I made a note of this in my journal, on parchment, with a stylus. The lander touched down with a lurch. The crash webbing bit into my shoulders. 6 Hecht let out the breath he had been holding since the atmospheric burn began. Korik stopped crying. Haust opened his eyes. And the world outside the lander, when the ramp cycled open, and the seal hissed, and the bone-grey light came curdling into the troop compartment like something slow and patient and unwelcome. The world outside smelled wrong. That is the thing I keep coming back to. That is the detail my journal insists on recording, over and over, in different words, as though my hand keeps trying to find the right phrasing and keeps failing. The world smelled wrong, not like a corpse, not like rot, not like promethium or ozone or the mineral dryness of a dead world. It smelled, I am putting this down as plainly as I can, it smelled like a room, a closed room, a room that has been sealed for a very long time, and whose air has grown stale and thick and sweetish, the way the air does in a shrine that has not been opened since the last confessor died. Kheth-Varnak smelled like the inside of a shut door, and we were the first souls in 60 million years to open it. The Magos emerged from Landa Primus and stood in the bone-grey light for a long time without moving. I watched him from the perimeter where my squad was setting the first line of auto-sentries. Ghrenn is 60% machine, 40% flesh, and at least some significant fraction of that flesh is no longer strictly biological, in the sense the Munitorum Medicae would recognize. He stands 7 feet tall in his vestments. He has 4 mechadendrites in a cruciform arrangement on his back. His head is a half-dome of augmetic plating with a single recessed ocular implant where the right eye used to be, and a cluster of smaller sensor nodes where the left eye used to be, and a Vox grill in place of a mouth. He is, in most respects, no longer a man at all. I say this without judgment. The Mechanicus way is the Mechanicus way. The Omnissiah calls whom he calls.
But I will say this. When the Magos emerged into the bone-grey light of Kheth-Varnak and stood there for a long time without moving, he did not look like a man in communion with the machine god.
He looked like a supplicant arriving at the altar of something he had been waiting his whole life to meet. His ocular implant was fixed upward, straight up, at the pylons, at the swollen, sagging sun above the pylons. His mechadendrites, which normally moved in restless, twitching arcs as his subcogitators processed incoming data, hung limp at his sides. His Vox grill was silent. I watched him stand there for 7 minutes by my chrono. The Skitarii around him, 10 of them, the finest honor guard the Mechanicus had been willing to dispatch, each one a walking war shrine of chrome and ceramite and sanctified Lars weaponry, held perfect formation and did not look at their Magos. I understood then that they had been ordered not to. I understood then that the Magos had anticipated his own reaction and had taken steps to ensure no witness to it. He had not anticipated me. I am a guardsman. Guardsmen are invisible to tech priests unless we are being useful or being blamed. I watched him. I kept watching him. I am a logister. It is my purpose. I write things down. When the 7 minutes ended, Magos Ghrenn lowered his gaze, shook himself once as though rousing from prayer, and turned to his Skitarii Primus with a gesture of command. The perimeter was established. The command tent was raised. The Skitarii deployed in a cordon around the excavation site. The servitors were unshackled from their transport cradles and began the slow, patient work of unloading the sanctified drilling rigs. Confessor Haust stood at the edge of the cordon and began the litany of sanctified ground, swinging his censer in slow arcs, filling the bone-grey air with the ozone-tinged smoke of blessed incense. The smoke did not rise. I watched it carefully. On any other world in the Imperium, on any world with an atmosphere at all, the smoke from a censer rises. It is the nature of heat. It is the nature of buoyancy. It is the nature of the Emperor's will expressed through thermodynamics. Haust's smoke did not rise. It came out of the censer. It hung in the air at the level he swung it. It curled in slow, horizontal spirals, as though the air of Kheth-Varnak were thicker than air should be, or as though something in the atmosphere were pressing down on the smoke and refusing to let it ascend. Haust noticed. I saw him notice. His litany faltered for one word, a single word, a single breath of hesitation, and then he resumed, because he is a confessor of the Imperial Creed, and he has buried that particular kind of hesitation under a lifetime of discipline. But he noticed, and I noticed him notice, and I wrote it down. There was wind. I want to record this clearly because it is the first thing I cannot explain, and because I know the Mechanicus report of this expedition. If any Mechanicus report ever reaches the Administratum, it will not mention it. Kheth-Varnak has no atmosphere to speak of. The trace gases the lander's sensors registered during descent were consistent with a near vacuum, argon, some helium, traces of something the cogitator logged as unclassified heavy particulate. Not enough to carry sound, not enough to carry the weather, not enough certainly to carry wind. There was wind. I felt it on the back of my neck within the first hour of planetfall. A slow, warm current of air was moving steadily from the direction of the largest pylon toward the valley where our command tent stood. It stirred the prayer ribbons on Confessor Haust's censer. It ruffled the pennant on the Cohort standard. It moved the bone-grey dust on the ground in slow, patient eddies. I asked 6 Hecht if he felt it. He did. I asked Adept Varel if the instruments registered it. The instruments did not. The anemometer array on the command tent read 0. The atmospheric sensors on the perimeter autosentries read 0. Every cogitator in the Cohort insisted, in its calm mechanical voice, that the air of Kheth-Varnak was still as a held breath. The wind blew. I felt it on my neck for the rest of the rotation. I feel it now. Writing this, seated in my prefab barracks with the pressure seal engaged and the air recycler humming a steady low note behind me. I feel it on my neck. It is not coming from the recycler. I have checked. It is coming from the direction of the pylons. It is warm. And it smells. I cannot help returning to this. The details insist on repeating themselves. It smells faintly like the inside of a shut door, like a room that has been closed for a very long time and is beginning, very slowly, to be opened. There are footprints in the glass sand. I noticed them toward the end of the first rotation, as I was walking the perimeter with 6 on a standard patrol. The obsidian dunes at the edge of the command camp bear our tracks in long, uneven lines. The boot prints of guardsmen and skitari crisscrossing the dust around the deployed autosentries, the broader drag marks of the servitor column hauling crates from the lander to the staging area. Ordinary, expected. The evidence of an expedition going about its work. There were other prints. They matched ours exactly, not similar, not close, exactly. The tread pattern of a Cadian issue combat boot, size 11, left foot, mine. My tread pattern, impressed in the glass sand in a long, confident stride leading away from the perimeter and into the dunes toward the base of the nearest pylon. I had not walked there. I had not walked anywhere near there. I had been on the western perimeter for the entire rotation, with 6 at my side and 3 separate cogitators recording my position by helmet vox for the duty log. The footprints led out into the dunes for perhaps 30 meters, then stopped. Not faded, not obscured by drift. Stopped, mid-stride, as though whoever had been walking there, whoever had been wearing my boots, walking with my gait, leaving my prints, had simply ceased to be a thing that required feet. 6 Hecht stood beside me and looked at the prints for a long time. Then he looked at me. Then he looked at the prints again. He said, "Those are yours, Veyl." I said, "I know." He said, "You didn't walk here." I said, "I know." He said nothing else for a long time. Then he said in a voice much quieter than his usual voice, the voice he used once before, on Kashan, when we found the Shrine of the 12 and understood what had been done in it. "This place feels like a cathedral somebody forgot to finish building." I wrote it down. I am writing it down now. I did not know then that I would come to remember that line as clearly as I remember my mother's face. I did not know then that I would come to understand exactly what he meant, and exactly how wrong he was, and exactly how the architects of that cathedral had never stopped. Building had simply been waiting, very patiently, for the right materials to walk willingly through the door. The command briefing was held at 18th hour, standard reckoning. The command tent was a prefab of sanctified Martian weave, large enough to accommodate the cohort's senior staff in uncomfortable proximity. Magos Ghrenn at the head of the table, Skitarii Alpha Primus Taranth at his right, standing silent, a Vox grill and a pair of glowing green oculars beneath a chrome cowl. Confessor Haust at the Magos' left, clutching his censer, his face paler than I had ever seen it. Adept Discipulus Iona Varel, Ghrenn's junior, and, I would come to learn, the only member of his priesthood who still remembered what it was to be afraid of something, seated at the far end with a data slate clutched in her hands. And me, the Logister, the guardsman, the one nobody had wanted present, and whose presence was required by Munitorum Writ because the escort detachment commander must be briefed on the objective parameters of any expedition he is tasked to protect. I sat, I listened, I wrote. Magos Ghrenn's voice, when it issued from his Vox grill, had the quality of two cogitators arguing in the next room, a doubled resonance, a harmonic that never quite resolved. I have heard many tech priests speak. I had never heard one whose voice made my teeth itch. He began with the objective. The cohort was tasked with the breach and survey of the primary tomb complex of Kheth-Varnak, designated Sepulchre Prime. The complex lay at the base of the central pylon, the largest of the three, the one my wrong footprints had been walking toward. Initial Mechanicus estimates, based on orbital auspex and geological survey, placed the complex at a minimum depth of 400 meters below the surface, with an estimated internal volume equivalent to a small hive city. Necrodermis signatures consistent with a major Necron tomb dynasty. Stasis signatures consistent with long-cycle dormancy, undisturbed since the Magos paused. Here, for a calculated fraction of a second, since an epoch predating mammalian life on most classified imperial worlds. 60 million years, he said, give or take. The objective was not the tomb itself. The objective, he said, was an artifact catalogued by an earlier Mechanicus expedition 60 standard years ago. An expedition that had transmitted one and only one picked capture before going silent and being formally written off as lost. The picked capture was the reason Cohort Omega-Vryth was now standing on the bone-grey shore of a world that should never have been approached. He activated the tent's central hololith. The pict resolved above the table in grainy monochrome. It showed a doorway. The doorway was set into a wall of what I took to be necrodermis, that green-black metal the Xenos, metal dead, use for their tombs. The metal that does not rust, does not tarnish, does not yield to any weapon in the Imperium's arsenal, short of a melter bomb detonated at point-blank range. The doorway was perhaps 3 meters tall. Its frame was plain. Its surface was not. The surface of the doorway was covered in script. The script was molten. I do not mean this as a metaphor. The pict, though still, somehow conveyed motion. The viewer looking at it received the distinct and sourceless impression that the script on the door was flowing, shifting, rearranging itself in patterns that the pict recorder had not been fast enough to capture. The glyphs were not Necrontyr. I had seen Necrontyr glyphs before, on a requisition slate during the Kashan reclamation. Necrontyr glyphs are sharp, angular, and mathematical. These glyphs were wet. They were curled. They suggested to the human eye, not writing but anatomy, the veins of a thing, the nerves of a thing, the internal cabling of a thing that had been flayed open for inspection. I felt my gorge rise, looking at them. Confessor Haust made the sign of the Aquila and did not lower his hand. Adept Varel, to her credit, did not flinch, but her knuckles went white on the edge of her data slate. And at the base of the doorway, in the dust that had accumulated across 60 million years of undisturbed dormancy, the Pict showed a shape, a figure, curled, man-sized, hunched against the base of the door, as though it had been sleeping there, as though it had been waiting there. The Pict's resolution was not sufficient to render features, only the silhouette, only the posture, only the terrible, terrible suggestion that whatever it was not Necrontier, and it was not human, and it had been curled in the dust at the base of that door for longer than the Imperium of man had existed, waiting perhaps for someone to come down the long dark corridor with a Pict recorder and acknowledge at last that it was there. Magos Ghrenn let the Pict hang in the air over the table for a long moment. Then he said, in that doubled cogitator voice, the sentence that I have written down more times than any other sentence in this journal. I cannot stop writing it down, because every time I write it down, I remember it a little more clearly and understand it a little more exactly. It is no longer there. The dust has been disturbed. Nobody spoke. Confessor Hout's sensor stopped swinging. I had not noticed until it stopped that it had been swinging in time with the slow, warm wind from the pylons. I noticed now. I noticed also that Magos Ghrenn's ocular implant, the single recessed eye in the half-dome of his augmetic skull, was fixed not on the hololith, but on me, directly on me, as though he had been waiting through the entire briefing for the one man at the table whose profession it was to write things down, to finish writing down this particular detail. I met his gaze. He did not blink. He does not have eyelids. The courtesy is not available to him. After a long moment, the ocular implant tracked away, back to the hololith, and the briefing continued. Equipment loadouts, excavation schedules, perimeter protocols, the dry, necessary minutiae of any Mechanicus expedition recited in the Vox Grill's steady, doubled voice. I wrote it all down. My hand moved of its own accord. My mind was elsewhere. My mind was in the dust at the base of that door. My mind was considering the shape of the thing that had been curled there, and the shape of the empty place where it no longer was, and the 60 years between the Pict and now, and the distance from that door to the surface, and the precise and patient nature of a creature that would remain still for 60 million years, and then, in the brief blink of a human lifetime, rise and walk somewhere the Pict recorder could no longer see. I did not sleep that rotation. I tried. The prefab barracks are warm. They are sealed. They have a pressure differential of half a bar above ambient, which means the atmosphere of Kheth-Varnak cannot enter them, which means the slow warm wind from the pylons cannot enter them, which means the sweetish smell of a shut door cannot enter them. I could still smell it. I lay on my cot, and I listened to the air recycler hum its steady low note, and I watched the lumen strip on the ceiling sputter its rhythmic dying gasp pulses. 2 beats. Pause. 2 beats. Pause. The machine spirit of the barracks flickering its last slow supplication into the dark, and I tried to sleep. I could not. The Vox bead in my ear was the problem. Regulation requires guardsmen to maintain an active Vox bead during rest cycles on unsecured worlds. The bead is tuned to the squad frequency. It should carry nothing but silence and the occasional perimeter check from the rotational sentries. The bead was not silent. Beneath the carrier wave, beneath the faint hiss that is the Vox bead's natural resting hum, there was something else, a rhythm, a slow, steady, deep-toned pulse. 2 beats, pause, 2 beats, pause. It was almost the rhythm of the lumen strip. It was almost the rhythm of my own heart. It was almost, and this is the thing that kept me awake, the thing that is keeping me awake now, the thing I have put down here on parchment because my cogitator journal cannot be trusted with it. It was almost, but not quite, the rhythm of breathing, a thing that had held its breath for 60 million years, a thing that was only now, very slowly, remembering how to exhale. I listened to it for a long time. I tried to convince myself it was my own pulse, conducted through the bone of my skull into the Vox pickup. I tried to convince myself it was the air recycler's compressor cycling through its duty loop. I tried to convince myself it was a malfunction, an artifact, a glitch in a poorly sanctified Vox bead that had been requisitioned from a Munitorum warehouse where corners had been cut. I did not succeed. The rhythm continued. Somewhere, far beneath my prefab barracks, far beneath the bone-grey dust and the obsidian dunes and the canted teeth of the pylons, something was breathing. It was breathing in time with the failing lumen strip above my cot. Or, and this is the thought I have not been able to unthink, the thought that has curled itself in the dust at the base of my mind and will not now go away. The lumen strip was breathing in time with it. I wrote in my journal, by hand, on parchment. 6 joked that the world feels like a cathedral. He is right. But I do not think the architects have left. I underlined the sentence 3 times. I do not know why. It seemed important that the sentence be emphasized, that it be set apart from the other sentences, that it be marked as the one piece of the record that mattered most. I set down my stylus. I closed the journal. I lay in the dark, and I listened to the thing beneath the world breathe, and I did not sleep. And the sun that does not set on Kheth-Varnak, the swollen, sagging, tallow-colored sun, continued its slow, curdled descent toward a horizon it would never quite reach. And in the command tent, 60 meters from my barracks, Magos Ghrenn stood unmoving before the hololith of the doorway, and at the edge of the perimeter, Confessor House knelt in the bone-grey dust and wept into his censer. And somewhere in the dunes, a set of my own footprints walked alone toward the base of the central pylon, and stopped, and waited, and did not come back. The first rotation on Kheth-Varnak ended. The second began. I did not know it yet, but by the end of the second rotation, I would be one of the last men in the cohort who still remembered, clearly and without revision, what the world had smelled like when we first stepped off the lander. The architects were very patient. They had already begun building. The bone-grey shore has been reached, traveler. The perimeter is set. The footprints have been discovered in the dust, and the wind that does not exist has begun to blow, and something beneath the world is remembering how to breathe. Chapter 1 ends here. Chapter 2 awaits you. The unease will deepen. The servitors will begin moving in ways their cortex cogitators cannot account for. The map of Sepulchre Prime will begin to redraw itself in the night. And a Vox thief recording will surface, speaking in a voice no member of the cohort has ever used, calling Logister-Sergeant Dren by his full name and rank. Until then, secure your Geller field. Mark this chronicle with your approval. Join the crew. The Voidborn signal holds, for now. The Emperor protects. The signal holds, Traveler of the Void. The Geller field endures. You are still with us. Good. Few make it past the first chapter of an Obsidian Veyl transmission with their attention intact. Fewer still choose to descend further. That you are here means one of 2 things. Either the Emperor's grace has placed a hand upon your shoulder, or something on the other side of this recording has placed a different kind of hand upon it and is guiding you down into the dark. I cannot tell which is which from this side of the Vox. Mark this chronicle with your approval to keep the field stable. Join the crew by subscribing to the archive so that when the final transmission arrives, you do not miss it. The YouTube gift link remains in the data below for those who would offer tithe. What follows is the second chapter of the Vox-Journal of Logister-Sergeant Veyl Dren. The entries in this chapter were recorded across 3 planetary rotations. Internal Mechanicus timestamping indicates these rotations occurred consecutively. Independent analysis of the carrier wave signatures indicates they did not. Some of these entries were written more than once. Descend, traveler. Chapter 2. Supplications in the Dust. 3rd rotation, Kheth-Varnak. Standard chrono reckoning is no longer reliable. My personal chrono disagrees with the command tent chrono by 41 minutes. The command tent chrono disagrees with the Magos' internal cogitator by an additional 17 minutes. The Magos' internal cogitator disagrees with the orbital beacon of the Umbra Laudatum, which has been logging our rotations from a holding pattern in geosync by 1 hour and 6 minutes. All of them are drifting. None of them is drifting the same way. I have stopped trying to reconcile them. I am marking time by the pulse beneath the carrier wave now. 2 beats, pause, 2 beats, pause. The rhythm has grown louder over the past 2 rotations. I no longer need to lie still and listen to hear it. It is in the air recycler's hum. It is in the lumen strip's sputter. It is in the footsteps of the Skitarii on patrol, whose armored boots ring against the prefab decking, in what I am almost certain is a synchronized pattern none of them have been ordered to keep. I have not told anyone this.
I do not think I need to.
I think everyone has noticed. I think nobody wants to be the first to say it out loud, because once it is said out loud, it becomes a real thing, and real things on Kheth-Varnak have a way of turning their attention toward the speaker. I was assigned to the tunnel mouth watch this rotation. Mechanicus protocol requires a standing guardsman detail at the entrance to any active excavation site. The logic is straightforward. The Skitarii guard the Magos and his adepts within the tunnel. The servitors perform the labor, and the guardsmen stand at the mouth and watch for whatever might attempt to enter from the surface. On most worlds, the surface side threat is the significant one. Xenos raiders, heretic cultists, opportunistic wildlife. A guardsman at the mouth of a Mechanicus dig is a man posted against the known dangers of an unknown world. On Kheth-Varnak, the logic has inverted. We are not watching the surface. We are watching the tunnel. The Skitarii know this. The Magos knows this. Nobody has said it, but every guardsman assigned to tunnel mouth rotation since the excavation began has found himself facing inward. Lasegun braced, eyes fixed on the descending dark, and none of us have been reprimanded for breaking regulation posture. The reprimand would require someone to state, officially, what we are actually guarding against. No one is willing to do that. So I stood at the mouth with 6 Hecht and Inez Pala, and we watched the dark, and the dark watched us back. The tunnel descends at a 40-degree angle into the base of the central pylon. The mechadendrite drills of the servitor column have carved it smooth, the walls lined with the glassy residue of superheated obsidian bedrock. Lumen strips have been pinned at 6-meter intervals along the descent, each one sanctified by Confessor Haust in a litany that took him the better part of a full rotation to complete. I watched him consecrate the lumens. His hands shook. He finished the rite. The lumens burn. They burn unevenly. That is the detail I want to record. The lumens are uniform Mechanicus standard issue, drawn from sanctified stock, installed by the same servitor team, powered by the same sub-generator, blessed by the same confessor in a single continuous rite. They should burn identically. They do not. The first 3 lumens nearest the surface burn bright and steady. The next 3 burn dim, their light the color of old teeth. The 3 after that flicker in a slow rhythm that I recognized, with a dull, cold feeling in my stomach, as 2 beats, pause, 2 2 beats. Pause. Beyond those, the lumens do not appear to burn at all. They are lit. The Mechanicus log screens in the command tent confirm they are drawing power and emitting photons at specification. But when you stand at the tunnel mouth and look down, the dark beyond the 9th lumen is simply dark, as though the light is being produced and then absorbed by something before it can reach your eye. 6 noticed first. He stood beside me for the first hour of the watch, saying nothing, staring into the tunnel. Then, without turning his head, he said very quietly, "The light isn't making it up, Veyl." I knew what he meant. "I see it," I said. "Do we report it?" "To who?" He was silent for a long time. Then he said, "Yeah, fair." Palla, a few paces behind us, racked her long lass and said nothing at all. Palla has not said much since the 2nd rotation. Palla lost her homeworld before she enlisted. Palla is, of all of us, the one most accustomed to silence, and the one whose silence I have learned to pay the closest attention to. When Palla goes quiet, it is because she has seen something she does not want to name out loud, and she is waiting to see whether it also sees her. Palla had been quiet for most of a rotation and a half. I did not ask her what she had seen. I trusted her to tell me when it mattered. She would. She does. The tunnel exhales. I want to record this precisely, because my journal, the parchment journal, the one I write by hand, has begun to develop anomalies of its own, and I cannot be certain that what I write today will be what I read tomorrow. The tunnel exhales. A slow, warm current of air issues from its mouth at irregular intervals, perhaps once every 40 minutes by the rhythm of my own pulse. It is the same air that blows from the direction of the pylons across the surface of the camp. The same warm, sweetish shut-door smell. It issues from the mouth of the excavation in long, patient breaths, and then the tunnel falls still. And then, 40 minutes later, it exhales again. The Mechanicus anemometer at the tunnel mouth has been recalibrated 4 times. It continues to report 0 atmospheric movement. I asked Adept Varel about it on the 2nd rotation, when I passed her in the supply tent, drawing a fresh data slate from the sanctified stores. She looked at me for a long moment before answering. Her eyes, she still has her original eyes, unlike most of her priesthood, a detail I find I am increasingly grateful for, were tired, red-rimmed. The eyes of a woman who has not been sleeping, or has been sleeping and finding no rest in it. "The machine spirit," she said carefully, "cannot measure what it has not been instructed to measure." Meaning the anemometer is calibrated for atmospheric motion. The phenomenon at the tunnel mouth is not atmospheric. Then what is it? She looked away. She drew her slate. She said very softly, in a tone that was almost but not quite a confession, "Sergeant, I do not know, and the Magos has instructed me not to know." She left. I did not stop her. I wrote it down. The first true wrongness, the first one I could not, even with the most generous charity of interpretation, explain away as stress or unfamiliarity, or the cumulative sleep debt of a man 3 rotations into a cursed expedition, was the servitors. Mechanicus labor servitors are lobotomized servant constructs, half-men reduced to the minimum neural function required to operate their assigned machinery. They do not think, they do not dream, they do not deviate. Their entire existence is a litany of task execution, repeated until the body fails and the body is replaced, and the litany continues through a new set of once human hands. The labor servitors of Cohort Omega-Vryth had begun moving in synchrony. I noticed it toward the end of my 2nd watch rotation at the tunnel mouth. 2 of the heavy lifter servitors were stationed near the supply tent, hauling sanctified excavation crates. From the lander barge staging area to the tunnel ingress. Standard work, repetitive work, the kind of work servitors exist to perform. They were performing it in perfect unison, not similar unison, not the approximate coordination of two units assigned to the same task cycle. Perfect unison. Every lift of every crate, every rotation of every mechadendrite, every plodding step of every augmetic leg, synchronized to within a tolerance my unaided eye could not detect a gap in. When one of them turned its head to align its ocular implant with a crate, the other turned its head at precisely the same instant, by precisely the same angle, though the crate it was aligning with was in a different location. They were not looking at the same things. They were moving the same way. I watched them for the better part of an hour, pretending to check the perimeter sensors. I have been a logister for 11 years. I have watched servitors at work on 60-odd worlds. I know how they move. I know the rhythm of their programming. Servitors do not synchronize. Servitors do not coordinate. Servitors lack the neural architecture required for either. These two servitors were synchronizing. And then I noticed the shadows. The command camp is lit by a combination of ambient sunlight, such as it is, on a world lit by a curdled tallow-colored star, and the overhead lumen arrays mounted on the prefab awnings. The lumen arrays cast sharp shadows on the packed dust ground and on the walls of the prefab tents behind the working servitors. I watched the shadows as the servitors lifted a crate in their perfect unison, pivoted 90 degrees, and set it down. The shadows lagged, half a second, perhaps less. The bodies of the servitors stopped moving. Their shadows on the tent wall behind them continued moving for a fraction of a second longer, completing the motion the bodies had already abandoned. Then the shadows stopped. Then the servitors resumed. Their shadows did not begin moving again until the bodies had already moved for half a second. I am putting this down as plainly as I can because I understand how it reads on the page. It reads as a hallucination. It reads as a tired man's eye playing tricks on itself in the bone-grey light of a strange world. It reads as exactly the sort of anomaly that any sane logister would omit from his formal record, because the inclusion of such a detail marks him as a man whose testimony can no longer be trusted. I am including it anyway. That is the purpose of this journal. That is why it is unsanctioned, and why I will face the flogging when I am recovered from this expedition. Because the formal record will not permit this observation, and because the observation is true. The shadows of the servitors were not behaving as shadows. They were behaving as something else, cast in the shape of shadows, doing the shape's work because the shape was required of them, but running on a rhythm that was not quite the rhythm of the bodies that ought to have cast them. I looked away. I looked back. The phenomenon had ceased. The shadows were once again ordinary shadows, moving with their bodies in the proper synchrony that the laws of photonics require of them. I do not know how long they had been doing it before I noticed. I do not know how long they had been doing it, undetected, before I noticed how to notice. The maps began to change at night. I call it night out of habit. Kheth-Varnak does not truly have a night. The curdled sun does not set. It only dims, sagging lower against the horizon, and then rising again without ever having properly fallen. The rotation of the planet is either wrong, or the sun is not where the sun ought to be. The Mechanicus astronomer servitor has been asked to clarify this and has, in response to the third inquiry, simply ceased emitting audio output. It continues to calculate. It no longer reports the results. In the period that the cohort designates as night, the dimming cycle, when the overhead light curdles to the color of old bone and the shadows across the camp grow long and listless, the internal cogitators of the command tent perform their diagnostic cycles. They recalibrate, they refresh, they cross-reference, they repeat their litanies of machine spirit maintenance, and they re-sanctify their sacred data stacks against the small accumulated errors of a full rotation's use. And in that dimming cycle, the map of Sepulchre Prime has begun to redraw itself. Adept Veyl is responsible for the master Auspex cartograph of the excavation. It is her duty at the end of each rotation to integrate the day's surveyed chambers into the overall map of the tomb complex, building outward from the tunnel mouth into the vast unmapped interior that lies beyond our current dig. The map is displayed in hololith at the center of the command tent. It has been updated each rotation since we breached the first antechamber on the second rotation of our dig. On the third rotation, Adept Veyl came to my barracks at what the chrono insisted was third hour, but which my bones insisted was much later. She was carrying a data slate. Her hands were shaking. She asked very quietly whether she could sit. I told her she could. She sat. She put the data slate on my cot between us. She activated it. The slate displayed the hololith of Sepulchre Prime as of the previous rotation's integration. A long central corridor, descending at its 40-degree angle from the tunnel mouth, terminating in a pillared antechamber we had mapped on the second rotation. 3 side passages, each extending a short distance before dead-ending at sealed Necron blast shutters we had not yet attempted to breach. The total surveyed volume was precisely 472 cubic meters, a figure Veyl had calculated by hand, and which I had, as a matter of dutiful cross-reference, independently verified. She then activated the slate's second overlay, the Master Auspex cartograph from the command tent. As of this rotation's morning integration, the map had grown, not from the front, not from the excavation face, where new chambers would naturally have been added as our dig progressed. Our dig had not progressed. The servitor column had not operated during the dimming cycle. No Auspex probe had been sent deeper into the complex. Nothing, by any ordinary reckoning, should have been added to the map. The map had grown by 93 cubic meters. From the back, from parts of the complex we had not surveyed, not approached, not sent probes into. A new chamber had appeared to the east of our central corridor, connected to nothing we had previously mapped, extending some 17 meters into a region of rock that our prior Auspex sweeps had reported as solid bedrock. It had a stairwell. The stairwell descended. It led downward into regions the cartograph did not extend to map. The stairwell had not been there the previous rotation. The stairwell had not been there when Veyl completed her integration 6 hours earlier. The stairwell was there now, rendered in the crisp green line hololith of a confirmed Auspex verified architectural feature, and the machine spirit of the cartograph would not retract it when she instructed it to. I told the Magos, she said. Her voice was very steady. The steadiness was the steadiness of a woman holding herself together with both hands. He called it machine spirit recalibration. He has increased the cogitator's offerings of sacred oil. He has instructed me not to investigate further. And you came here. And I came here. Why? She looked at me. The look was long. It was tired. It was the look of a junior tech priest who had realized, in the course of her duties, that her senior was lying to her, and that the lie was not a small one. Because you are a Logister, she said, and Logisters write things down. And if this rotation ends in a way I fear it may end, Sergeant, I would prefer that at least one record exist, which is not controlled by the Magos. She left the data slate with me. She asked me to duplicate the overlay onto my parchment journal. I did. I have it here in front of me now, transcribed in my own hand. The shape of the corridor, and the new chamber, and the descending stairwell that was not there the previous rotation, and is there now. I studied the new chamber for a long time after she left. The stairwell descended in a spiral. It was drawn in the crisp green line of an Auspex confirmed feature, but the spiral itself was wrong. The turns of the stairs did not match the geometric conventions of Necron architecture, which favors cold right angles and fluted pillars, nor did they match the conventions of Imperial architecture, which favors the buttressed and the reinforced. The spiral descended in a pattern of uneven turns. Counting them was difficult. I tried to count the turns. I kept losing count. Each time I counted them, I arrived at a different number. The first count, 11. The second, 17. The third, 9. The fourth time I attempted to count, I realized that my hand had stopped moving, and my eyes had been fixed on the spiral for an indeterminate period of time, and the rhythm of the breathing beneath the carrier wave had grown noticeably louder in my Vox speed, and I closed the data slate without completing the count. I have not opened it since. I have also not been able to find it, this rotation, though I put it on the shelf above my cot and have not left the barracks. I mention this in passing. It is, at this point, one anomaly among many. 7 Omicron did not return. Of all the servo skulls in Cohort Omega-Vryth, 7 Omicron was the one I knew best by sight. It was an older model, pre-heresy by some accounts, the augmetic cranium of a long-dead adept repurposed into an Auspex probe and tethered to the Magos' command frequency. Its grav plate was decorated with faded Aquila scrollwork. Its primary ocular had a faint tremor that caused it to scan in a slightly erratic sweep. It was an idiosyncratic machine. I had watched it drift past my barracks on a dozen patrols and had come, in the small unacknowledged way a guardsman comes to recognize the ordinary furniture of his deployment, to feel a certain distant fondness for it. 7 Omicron was dispatched into the tunnel on the second rotation, tasked with forward Auspex sweeps of the unexplored passages beyond the first antechamber. Standard protocol. The skull was meant to return at the end of its 6-hour cycle for data transfer and recharging. It did not return. The Mechanicus search protocol for a missing servo skull is straightforward. The skull's last known coordinates are pulled from the command cogitator. A retrieval servitor is dispatched to those coordinates. The skull is recovered, or the absence of the skull is noted, and a deeper sweep is ordered. None of this occurred. I learned through Adept Veyl that Magos Ghrenn had formally declined the retrieval. The skull, he said, was not lost. The skull was still transmitting. The skull was simply no longer transmitting from where it had been sent. Confessor Haust, when he learned of this, went to the command tent and engaged the Magos in what the Skitari assigned to tent security would later report in their clipped Vox Grill summaries as a vigorous theological exchange of uncertain doctrinal alignment. I heard part of it from my post at the perimeter. Haust's voice, raised, shaking with an anger I had not previously heard him capable of. Then where in the throne's name is it transmitting from, Magos? Ghrenn's answer was not audible from my position. Haust emerged from the tent 10 minutes later, his face the color of the bone-gray dust, his sensor clutched in a grip that had driven the chain of its handle into the meat of his palm, hard enough to bleed. He did not speak to me. He did not speak to anyone. He walked to his personal prefab, which he had never before entered during daylight hours, and he sealed the hatch behind him, and he did not emerge for the remainder of the rotation. I asked that evening what Ghrenn had said. It was Cohort, the Voxman, young and nervous, and already beginning to show the 1,000-yard stare that too long exposure to a haunted signal can produce in an unseasoned Vox operator, who answered me. Cohort had been on Vox watch in the command tent during the exchange. He had heard it all. Cohort told me, in a voice that was steady only by virtue of the fact that he had rehearsed the sentence several times before speaking it, that Magos Explorator Magos Ghrenn had told Confessor Haust, in the doubled cogitator voice that made the teeth itch, that the servo skull 7 Omicron was now transmitting from a location approximately 412 meters below the planetary surface, a depth 300 meters deeper than our excavation had yet reached. The skull's Auspex transmitter was still active, Ghrenn had said. The skull was still sending back pick data. The pick data was interesting, Ghrenn had said, and he was reviewing it personally, and he would share the results with the cohort at such time as he judged the data suitably prepared for general dissemination. He had not yet so judged. Everyone in the cohort was having the dream. I did not realize this until the 4th rotation. It came up almost by accident, in the mess tent, over a ration loaf that had the grey sheen of promethium-cured protein gone slightly wrong, at some point between its processing and our plates. 6 Hecht was eating. Pala was eating. I was eating. Korik was picking at his food and not eating. Guardsman Thol, the new transfer, the quiet one, the one who had transferred into the cohort at the staging station at Port Moore, and whom none of us had particularly warmed to, was eating methodically, in a slow mechanical rhythm that I found, in retrospect, I had been noticing without noticing for the last 2 rotations. It was Korik who mentioned it. Did anyone else, he said, not looking up from his ration loaf, dream about the door? 6 stopped chewing. Pala set down her utensil. I felt the warm wind from the pylons on the back of my neck. I had been feeling it, in fact, for the entire meal. I had stopped noticing it, the way a man stops noticing the smell of his own barracks after he has lived in them for a month. I noticed it now. It was warmer than it had been yesterday. It smelled more strongly of the shut door. "What door?" said 6. His voice was carefully neutral. Korik looked up. His eyes were the eyes of a man who had been hoping someone else would speak first, and who had been braced for the alternative of having to be the one who said it. "The door with the script," he said. "The one from the briefing picked. The one with the..." He hesitated. "The one with the figure curled in the dust." Pala, very quietly. "The figure isn't curled." We all looked at her. "In the dream," she said. Her voice was as even as her sniper's breath. "The figure isn't curled anymore. It's standing. It's standing on the other side of the door, and it has pressed its face against the metal, and it's smiling at me." The silence at the table was the silence of 4 human beings, and one guardsman Thol, who had not stopped eating, who had not looked up, who had continued his slow, methodical chewing through the entire exchange, as though none of it were being spoken, realizing that all of them had dreamed the same thing. "It's smiling at me too," said Korik. "And me," said 6. I said nothing. I had also had the dream. I had had it every night since the 2nd rotation. I had written it down in my journal, and then, the following morning, I had found that the entry had been rewritten, not erased, not altered in content, but rewritten in my own handwriting, with certain key details subtly changed. The figure had been curled in my first entry. In the rewritten entry, it had been sitting upright. In the entry I wrote the following rotation, it had been standing. In the entry I wrote the rotation after that, it had been pressing its face to the metal of the door. I had not rewritten any of these entries consciously. I had not rewritten any of them at all by my own reckoning. But the handwriting was mine, and the ink was the ink of my stylus, and the journal was my journal. I did not tell the others this. I did not tell them that my dreams were not mine, or that my journal was not mine, or that something in the bone-grey air of Kheth-Varnak was reaching into the small private spaces of my record-keeping and revising them in my own hand. I did not tell them because I could not prove it, and because the telling would mark me as broken, and because this is the true reason, and I am making myself write it down, because I suspected that everyone at the table was carrying their own version of the same private revision, and that the telling would only force us all to acknowledge how far along the process already was. We finished our meal in silence. Guardsman Thole continued to chew in his slow, methodical rhythm, and did not look up and did not speak. I noticed later that his rhythm matched the pulse beneath the carrier wave. 2 beats, pause, 2 beats, pause. The Skitarii breached the outer seal of Sepulchre Prime at 12th hour of the 5th rotation. I was not in the breach team. Guardsmen are not deployed in the forward ranks of a Mechanicus tomb breach. It is a matter of doctrinal purity, the Magos' prerogative to be first across any threshold of Xenos significance. I stood at the tunnel mouth with Six and Pala, as I had stood for the previous rotations, and I listened to the Vox feed from the forward element as they approached the sealed gate. The gate was not sealed. This is what the Vox feed reported in the clipped Mechanicus cant of Alpha Primus Taranth's Vox grill. Gate integrity, nominal. Gate status, open. Gate fusion indicators, consistent with seal failure of approximate age 60 years. 60 years. I felt a cold thing settle in the pit of my stomach. The previous Mechanicus expedition, the one that had transmitted one picked and then gone silent forever, had been 60 standard years ago. The gate that the Magos' fresh new expedition had come to breach had been open for 60 years. It had been open since the previous expedition had stood in front of it. It had been open, perhaps, because the previous expedition had opened it, and had entered it, and had never been heard from again. Not because they had died on the surface or in the tunnel, but because they had descended past that threshold, and something had met them on the other side, and that something had been willing to wait 60 years for the Imperium to send a follow-up. The Magos, on the command tent Vox, issued a calm clinical affirmation and ordered the breach team to proceed. I had no authority to object. I objected anyway. In writing, a formal written protest filed through the command tent scribe servitor and countersigned by my thumbprint. The scribe servitor accepted the filing. Adept Varel, when I saw her an hour later, confirmed that the filing had been logged. The filing has since been expunged from the command record. I checked this rotation. It is no longer there. My thumbprint is no longer there. The scribe servitor that accepted the filing has been reassigned to labor servitor duty in the excavation column, and its cortex cogitator has been sanctified wiped for reasons the Magos has not disclosed. I am recording this here, in parchment, with my stylus, because this is the only record of the protest that now exists. I was, for the record, opposed. The forward element descended into Sepulchre Prime. Vox transmission from the element was intermittent. The deeper they descended, the more the signal degraded, the carrier wave fracturing into the same 2-beat pause rhythm that had been haunting my sleep. Taranth's voice came through in fragments. Pillared hall, sarcophagi in alcoves, preservation nominal, power trickle in the necrodermis, thermal reading anomalous. Anomalous how? The command tent Vox officer asked. Warm, said Taranth. A long pause. The Vox officer requesting clarification. Taranth repeating the word, warm. The tomb is warm. Temperature reading plus 18 degrees against expected ambient of -11. The tomb is warm. In the command tent, I later learned, Magos Ghrenn wept oil from his ocular implant. Adept Varel saw it, she told me. She said it quietly, as though the information were itself a sacrilege that could be overheard. He was weeping, Sergeant. With joy. He was weeping with joy. Why? She did not know why. I did not know why either then. I know why now. I will write down why when I come to the relevant rotation. But not yet. The record must proceed as the record was made. That is the discipline of the Logister. We do not rewrite backward, even when the temptation is very great. I was summoned to the tunnel at 14th hour. Magos Ghrenn required a guardsman presence in the initial survey element. Formal reasons cited: situational redundancy in unfamiliar environmental conditions. Actual reason, as I understood it from Varel's expression when she delivered the summons. The Magos wanted a human Logister present in the tomb, so that the eventual formal record of what was found there would bear the countersignature of an unaugmented witness. The Ordo Xenos would require it. The Administratum would require it. Ghrenn, whatever else he had become in his 60% of machinery and his ambition, was a Magos of the cult Mechanicus, and the cult Mechanicus was a creature of the Imperium, and the Imperium's bureaucracy required the thumbprint of a witness in flesh. So I descended. Six came with me. He did not ask permission. He fell in beside me at the tunnel mouth, and when I opened my mouth to order him back, he said very quietly, "No," and I did not pursue the matter. Palla came too, on the same unspoken initiative. Adept Varel was already at the threshold, her data slate clutched to her chest. 2 Skitarii flanked the Magos. Taranth's forward team had been ordered to hold position in the pillared hall. The Magos led. We descended. The tunnel was long. The lumens guttered in their uneven rhythm. The exhaled breath of Kheth-Varnak rose past us as we walked, warm and sweetish and thick with its shut-door smell, and our boots rang against the glassy obsidian of the tunnel floor in a rhythm that, I am recording this because it is true, was not our rhythm. I counted the beats of my footfalls. I counted sixes. I counted Palla's. I counted Ghrenn's mechadendrite-assisted stride. The individual rhythms of each of us were distinct, varied, idiosyncratic as gaits always are. The composite rhythm of our footfalls, echoing back from the walls of the tunnel, was 2 beats, pause, 2 beats, pause. We were walking in time with the breathing. I do not know whether we were making the rhythm or whether the rhythm was making us. I was no longer certain it mattered. We reached the threshold of Sepulchre Prime at 15th hour, and the Magos stepped across it without ceremony, and I followed him, and my life, such as it remained, such as anything in me that could still be called mine, ended. The pillared hall was a cathedral. I understood, standing at the threshold and looking into it, exactly what 6 had meant. The hall stretched forward into the dark for a distance the lumen beams of our helmets could not resolve. Pillars of green-black necrodermis rose to a vaulted ceiling, fluted with the cold, precise geometry of Necrontyr craft. Alcoves lined the walls at regular intervals, each alcove containing a sarcophagus of the same metal, each sarcophagus sealed. Thousands of them, stretching into the dark on both sides of us, rank upon rank, until the count defeated the eye, and the eye simply stopped trying. It was warm. I noticed it within 3 paces of the threshold. The cold of the tunnel, the cold that belonged to a dead world, and a 400-meter descent into solid rock, gave way abruptly to warmth, body warmth. The temperature of a closed room in which a living thing is sleeping, and the smell that had haunted the camp, the smell that came from the pylons and the tunnel mouth, and the warm wind that had no right to blow, was stronger here. Not oppressive, not rotten, intimate. The smell of a body beneath heavy blankets, sleeping, its warmth trapped in the fabric, its breath rising in slow, even exhalations into the close air of a shut bedroom. Confessor Haust was not with us. I found myself, for the first time in my adult life, wishing for a priest. Magos Ghrenn moved down the central aisle between the alcoves. His mechadendrites were extended. His ocular implant glowed a steady green, tracking and cataloging. His Vox grill emitted a low, continuous hum, which I recognized after a moment as a litany of Binharic praise. He was praying. He was moving through the tomb as a pilgrim moves through a shrine he has waited his whole life to visit. He stopped. He stood for a long moment, unmoving, before one particular alcove. Then he turned to the rest of us, and his ocular implant tracked across our faces and came to rest on mine and held. "Logister," he said, "you will attend." I attended. The alcove he was standing before was open, not the sarcophagus within it. The sarcophagus was open too, but that was the second thing I noticed. The first thing I noticed was that the alcove itself had no seal, no shield, no outer containment. Every other alcove in the hall was sealed with a membrane of shimmering necrodermis, a containment field of some nature, designed to preserve the sarcophagus within against time and incursion. This alcove's membrane was gone. Whether it had never been installed, or whether it had been removed, or whether it had simply ceased to exist in the manner that things on Kheth-Varnak were beginning, steadily, to cease to exist, I could not tell. The sarcophagus inside the alcove was open. The lid had been slid aside, not broken, not forced. Slid, smoothly and completely, in the manner of a container being opened from within by its occupant. The dust on the sarcophagus edge had been disturbed in a clear pattern. Handprints, or something the size and shape of handprints, pressed flat against the upper edge of the stone as something had levered itself upright and stepped out. There were tracks leading away from the sarcophagus. I leaned closer. My helmet lumen tracked across the floor. The tracks were dust prints, left by something that had pushed dust aside as it walked. They were the size of a man's footprints, not the size of a Necrontyr, who are taller and thinner and walk on metal feet that would not have disturbed dust in this fashion. These were the prints of something human-shaped, something that had stepped down from the sarcophagus and walked away from it, into the dark of the cathedral, in a long, confident stride. The tracks led perhaps 12 paces into the aisle. Then they stopped, not faded, not covered, stopped, mid-stride. The final print was a clean outline, 1 foot fully planted, the suggestion of weight still held upon it. And then nothing, as though whatever had been walking there had, at the instant of that final step, simply forgotten that it had feet, as though it had been wearing the idea of a body for long enough to cross a short distance, and had then, without ceremony, ceased to require the idea. I stared at the final footprint. 6, beside me, muttered the throne's name. Palla raised her long las. She pointed it into the dark of the aisle, past the final print, toward whatever the dust had been walking toward. Her finger was not on the trigger, but it was very close to the trigger, and her breathing had gone to the flat, slow discipline of a sniper's breath control. Magos Ghrenn said nothing at all for a very long time. Then he said in a voice that was almost, not the doubled cogitator voice, but the voice of a man, a frightened man, a small mortal thing speaking aloud because it could not contain the wonder of what it was seeing. "Beautiful." He said nothing else. We stood at the threshold of the open sarcophagus, in the warm, close air of the cathedral tomb, with the dust print of a thing that was no longer there stretching into the dark before us, and the Magos' Binharic litany of praise resumed, and the pulse beneath the carrier wave of my Vox bead grew louder, and I understood, with a clarity that I have not been able to write down before now, because the writing down of it has been a thing my hand has kept resisting. I understood that the sarcophagus had not been opened recently. It had been opened 60 years ago, probably, or more. The dust print we were looking at was not the print of a thing that had stepped out this rotation. It was the print of a thing that had stepped out long ago, and had been walking since, and had only stopped being visible as footprints at the moment it had no further need to leave footprints behind. Whatever had been in the sarcophagus was already out. It had been out for a very long time, and the pict from the previous expedition, the one that had shown a curled figure in the dust at the base of a door, that pict had been taken after the thing had left this sarcophagus. The curled figure at the base of the door was the thing. It had left the cathedral. It had walked to the door. It had curled there. It had been waiting for us to reach it. And in the 60 years between the pict and now, the dust had been disturbed. It was no longer curled. It had risen. It was standing somewhere in the dark beyond the final footprint. And the final footprint was only visible because it had chosen to leave it. And it had chosen to leave it because it wanted us to follow. Corric's voice came through the Vox. I was still staring at the final footprint. I did not hear the first transmission. 6 elbowed me. I looked up. Corric's voice was on the command tent Vox, routed through to our helmet channels, and he was breathless, and he was scared, and he was saying my name. Sergeant Dren, Sergeant Dren, respond. Sergeant Throne, please respond. We have a transmission. We have... Static. Then Corric's voice again, tighter. We have a Vox thief recording. The command tent array scanned it 2 hours ago. I couldn't. Sergeant, the Magos ordered me to delete it. I am not going to delete it. I am transmitting it to your personal Vox bead now. Please listen to it and tell me I am not going mad. The transmission came through. The voice on the recording was a man's voice, calm, reasonable, mid-conversation, as though the speaker had been in dialogue with someone for some time before the Vox thief array had caught the frequency. The voice spoke in low Gothic, with the slight, archaic lilt of the educated administratum. The voice was gentle. The voice was patient. The voice said, "And of course, Sergeant, we have been here far longer than they believe. Tell them we are pleased with the offering. Tell them we hope they brought more." And then the voice said my name. Not Sergeant, not Logister, not Dren. My full name, Veyl Dren. The name my mother had given me. The name I had carried off Cadia and never spoken aloud to any soul in Cohort Omega-Vryth. The name that was not on my service file and had been redacted from my personal identifiers when I was reassigned after the thing I do not write down, the thing from my homeworld, the thing that is the reason I am here on this cursed shore and not drinking quietly in a veteran's hall on Kasser Gallen. The voice said my name. It said it the way my mother had said it, and the recording ended. I did not move for a long time. I stood in the warm, close air of the cathedral tomb in front of the open sarcophagus, and I listened to the last echo of the recording in my helmet Vox, and I watched the final footprint in the dust, and I felt the warm wind that should not have existed moving past me toward the dark of the aisle, and I understood that the speaker of the recording was very close, and that the speaker of the recording was not a speaker in the sense I had always used the word, and that it had been waiting for me specifically, for Veyl Dren of Cadia, by name, by mother's voice, and that it had been patient enough to wait for the Imperium to send someone who could hear what it had to say. The offering. It had said the offering. I had not, in the moment, understood what the offering was. I understood later. I understood when I was back at my barracks, hours later, with my parchment journal open on my knees and my hand shaking too hard to write. The offering was not the expedition. The offering was not the artifacts we had come to extract. The offering was us. The Magos had known. Of course the Magos had known. The Magos had been weeping oil with joy when he first set eyes on this world. The Magos had pored over the pict of the door and the curled figure for 60 years, applying for dispensation after dispensation from an Ordo Xenos that had repeatedly refused him. until at last some fool in the administratum had signed the writ that sent a cohort and its guardsman escort to this bone-grey shore. The Magos had brought us here as a tithe. The Magos had delivered us, knowing what would be done with us, and had called it exploration. And the thing in the dark beyond the final footprint had been pleased with the offering, and it hoped we had brought more. I returned to my barracks at 19th hour. I sat on my cot. I opened my parchment journal. I tried to write the day's entry. My hand shook. I set down the stylus. I picked it up. I set it down again. Adept Varel came to the barracks at 20th hour. She did not knock. She did not speak. She held out a data slate. I took it. The slate contained 2 picts. The first was the original pict from the Lost Expedition 60 years ago. The doorway of molten script, the curled figure in the dust. The second was a fresh pict. Date stamped this rotation. Source: Servo Skull 7 Omicron, the skull that had been transmitting from 412 meters below the surface. The pict Ghrenn had been reviewing privately. The pict he had not yet judged ready for general dissemination. It showed the same doorway, the same molten script, the same dust. The figure was not curled. The figure was standing. The figure was facing the pict recorder. I stared at the pict for a long time. I could not resolve the features. The pict's resolution was sufficient, but my eyes would not cooperate. Every time I tried to focus on the figure's face, my vision drifted elsewhere, to the door behind it, to the dust at its feet, to the script on the frame. When I forced my eyes back to the face was not there, and then it was there, and then it was not. But I could see enough. I could see that it was not a Necron. I could see that it was shaped like a man, and that it was not a man, and that the shape of a man it was wearing was not quite the right fit, as though it had been chosen from a selection of available shapes and found to be approximately correct without being precisely correct. The arms were the wrong length. The head was the right size, but the wrong proportion. The stance, the confident, patient stance, the stance of something that had been waiting for a very long time and was now ready, was not a human stance at all, though every human who has ever stood in front of a door they intend to open someday would recognize it. The figure was facing the pict recorder, which meant it had known the pict recorder was there, which meant it had allowed the pict to be taken, which meant Adept Veyl very quietly from the doorway of my barracks. Sergeant, it has been looking up. For the whole time we have been here. It has been standing at the base of that door and looking up at us. It has been waiting for us to see it seeing us. I set down the slate. I looked at Veyl. I said, "Why are you telling me this?" She said, "Because I do not know who else to tell." I said, "The Magos." She said, "The Magos is the one who sent 7 Omicron down there to be seen." I sat on my cot in the warm, close air of my sealed barracks, and I listened to the slow, rhythmic pulse beneath the carrier wave of my Vox bead. 2 beats, pause, 2 beats, pause. And I understood, with the cold clarity of a man who has just finished counting the lumens in the tunnel and realized the count is wrong, that the rhythm was not breathing. It had never been breathing. It was counting. And the count beneath the carrier wave was running in the opposite direction from the count in the cathedral tomb below us, because the 2 counts were the same count, meeting in the middle, and the middle was very close now, very close. Perhaps 1 or 2 more rotations, perhaps less. The counts were meeting, and when they met, the thing that had been waiting at the base of the door would no longer be waiting. Veyl left. I sat on my cot. I listened to the count. I did not sleep. Somewhere, 412 meters below my barracks, a figure that was not quite a man stood in front of a door whose script was still flowing, and it was looking up, and it knew my name, and the dust around it was disturbed in the pattern of a thing that had begun to move with purpose. I put down my stylus. The lumen strip on my barracks ceiling guttered in its 2-beat rhythm. The warm wind I should not have been able to feel in a sealed, pressurized prefab moved across the back of my neck. The pulse in my Vox bead grew louder, and somewhere, very close now, very close, something that had been curled in the dust for 60 years, and had then stood, and had then waited, took one patient step toward the tunnel. "Tell them we are pleased with the offering," it had said. "Tell them we hope they brought more. The cathedral tomb has been breached, traveler. The offering has been acknowledged. The figure in the dust is no longer curled, and the count beneath the carrier wave is meeting itself in the middle of the dark. The signal still holds, traveler. Barely. The Geller field shudders but endures. Mark this chronicle to reinforce the shielding. Join the crew. The count beneath the carrier wave has not stopped. It will not stop now." Chapter 3. The Descending Litany. 7th rotation. Or perhaps the 6th. My chrono has stopped attempting to reconcile itself with the command tent reckoning. I have ceased to require it. The Magos ordered the accelerated descent at 4th hour. I was not present when the order was given. I learned of it from Adept Veyl, who came to my barracks with the color drained from her face, and her robes smelling faintly of sacramental oil gone rancid. She said the Magos had convened the senior staff, and declared that the Pict of the standing figure, the Pict Ghrenn had previously judged not ready for general dissemination, was a sensor artifact, a hallucination in the servo-skull's ocular cogitator, a malfunction consistent with long-cycle Auspex exposure to necrodermis stasis fields. Nobody believed him. Not Veyl, not Taranth, not Confessor Haust, who, Veyl reported, had risen from the briefing table mid-litany, struck the data slate from the hololith projector with a trembling hand, and walked out of the command tent without asking leave. Haust had not returned. Ghrenn had not pursued the matter. The excavation was to proceed. Drill cycles were to be doubled. The Skitarii forward element was to advance past the pillared hall and into the lower chambers within 18 hours. The artifact, the Magos said, required retrieval with expedited priority. He did not say why. I filed a second written protest through the scribe servitor. It too was expunged. I am recording this entry by hand. I recommend to any soul who finds this parchment that they trust no cogitator log on Kheth-Varnak. The cogitators here have been partially domesticated by something. They are no longer ours. Guardsman Thol died at 9th hour. He was found in his bunk by Korik, who had gone to rouse him for the watch rotation. Thol's eyes were open. His mouth was open. His hands were folded across his chest in a posture of deliberate repose, as though he had laid himself out for inspection. There was no visible injury. There was a sound. The Vox bead in Thol's ear was still active. It was not transmitting silence. It was transmitting 67 overlapping recordings of Thol's own voice, all of them simultaneous, all of them speaking different words in different tones. Some of them were whispering imperial prayers. Some of them were laughing. Some of them were singing a lullaby in a Cadian dialect I have not heard spoken since my grandmother died. One of them, and Korik swore to this, weeping, in the medici tent where he had half dragged me to witness the scene. One of them was speaking my name, in Thol's voice, over and over, with an inflection I found unbearably familiar and could not place. The Mechanicus medici servitor catalogued the death as spontaneous cerebral cessation, consistent with acute warp proximity shock. The catalogue was wrong. The Mechanicus medici servitor did not know it was wrong. I knew. Veyl knew. Haust, when I found him later in his sealed prefab, reeking of Amasek and sanctified incense in equal measure, knew. Thol had not died of warp shock. Thol had died because the thing beneath the world had been practicing on him. Thol had been the new transfer. Thol had been the one none of us warmed to. Thol had been, I realized too late, the one who had not dreamed the dream. Because Thol had not needed to dream the dream. Because Thol had been something other than Thol for longer than any of us had been able to recognize, and the thing inside him had grown tired of the costume and had set it aside. The 67 voices in his Vox bead were the voices it had been rehearsing. One of them, in particular, it had rehearsed in mine. The Skitarii began losing cohesion at 12th hour. 3 of them, in separate locations across the camp, simply stopped moving. They turned to face walls, one the prefab of the supply tent, one the inner bulkhead of the excavation tunnel, one the outer hull of Lander Secundus, and they stood there, motionless, unresponsive to Vox hail. Alpha Primus Taranth attempted the standard override litanies. They did not respond. He attempted the deeper command codes, the ones reserved for units exhibiting signs of corruption or taint. They did not respond. Taranth executed them. He did it himself. He did not delegate. He walked to each of the 3, pressed the muzzle of his radium carbine to the base of the cranium, and fired. The shots were precise. The bodies dropped. Taranth moved to the next without ceremony. I watched the 3rd execution from my post at the tunnel mouth. Taranth's Vox grill emitted at the moment of firing, a short Binharic phrase that Veyl later translated for me as, "Forgive this necessity, brother." The bodies were recovered for examination. The cortex cogitators had been scooped clean. I mean this literally. Veyl showed me the autopsy slates. The Skitarii's mechadendrites were intact. Their organic tissue was intact. Their neural pathways were physically undamaged. But the cortex cogitator, the sanctified machine soul at the heart of each unit, the thing that made a Skitarii more than a servitor and less than a man, had been removed. Not destroyed, not corrupted, removed. As though something had reached into each of them, through some aperture Veyl could not identify, and lifted the machine soul out cleanly, leaving the body standing and staring at a wall because the body, without its machine soul, no longer remembered what else to do. Veyl, examining the slates, said a thing I will not forget. Something is eating the machine souls, Sergeant, and it is eating them in the order they were sanctified. I asked her what that meant. She said, "The 3 Skitarii executed this rotation were the 3 whose sanctification rites I witnessed personally at the Forge of Portmore. They were sanctified on the same day, in the same hour, by the same tech priest. They are the first batch, Sergeant. It is eating us in order." I asked her when she had been sanctified. She did not answer. She left. At 15th hour, 6 and I were ordered into the lower chambers on a recovery patrol. Tech Adept Hahn, one of Ghrenn's juniors, not known to me personally, had failed to report back from a solo Auspex survey of the newly breached lower passage, the passage that led from the pillared hall down into the older architecture beneath. Ghrenn, for reasons he did not disclose, refused to dispatch a Skitarii retrieval team. He ordered guardsmen. He ordered specifically Logister-Sergeant Dren and Corporal Hecht, as they are the unaugmented witnesses best positioned to formally record the retrieval. We went. We did not have a choice. I asked Veyl before we descended whether she thought we would come back. She did not answer. She handed me a small sanctified Aquila pendant from her own robes and pressed it into my palm and closed my fingers around it and turned away. I have not parted with the pendant since. I am holding it now, in my left hand, as I write this. The metal is warm. It should not be warm. Nothing in the camp is warm, except the tunnel mouth and the cathedral tomb, and, I think, me. The descent was unremarkable until we passed the pillared hall. Beyond the hall, the passage narrowed. The smooth necrodermis walls gave way, within perhaps 40 paces, to something older. Stone. Rough-hewn stone of a grey, porous composition. Veyl's sanctified geological catalogue did not recognize. Organic curves replaced necrontyre right angles. The ceiling sagged in places. The floor sloped unevenly. The architecture was not Necron. The Necrons had built their tomb over this. The tomb above was the lid. The passage we were descending into was what the lid had been placed over. I want to record, for the sake of the record, that my hand shook as I walked, and my lasgun felt inadequate in a way no lasgun has ever felt inadequate in my 11 years of service. And Six beside me had gone silent in a way I had only heard him go silent once before, on Kashan, in the Shrine of the 12, before we understood what had been done there. The lumens on our helmets did not penetrate the dark the way they should have. The beams attenuated within perhaps 8 meters. Past that distance, the light simply stopped. Not diffused, not absorbed, stopped. As though the dark had a membrane, a soft yielding surface that accepted photons and did not return them. We found Tech Adept Han at 21 meters. He was alive. He was fused to the wall. I do not have the vocabulary. I am a logister. I write down what I see, what I saw. Han, his robes torn, his body from the waist up embedded in the porous grey stone of the passage wall at a depth of perhaps 30 centimeters. His flesh and the stone had intermingled. I cannot describe it more precisely than that. His ribs were visible through the stone, and the stone was visible through his ribs, and the boundary between the two had stopped meaning anything. His lower half hung free, his legs twitching in the slow, arrhythmic spasms of a body that had been separated from its own circulatory logic, but had not yet been informed of the separation. He was awake. He saw us. The wall behind him was breathing. I mean this also literally. The grey stone was expanding and contracting in slow, patient swells, perhaps once every 40 seconds, and Han's embedded body was moving with it, and his one unobscured eye was tracking us with full cognition, and he opened his mouth and he said very clearly, in a voice that was his own voice, and not yet the voice of the thing that was digesting him, "Please, please. It is still using my lungs to talk. Please, Sergeant. End it. End it before it finishes." Six made a small sound beside me. I do not know what the sound was. It was not a word. I raised my lasgun. I am a good shot. I have always been a good shot. I put one bolt through Han's forehead at a distance of 4 meters, and the bolt went through him, and it struck the grey stone behind his head, and the stone absorbed the bolt the way the dark had absorbed the lumen light, and Han's eye went empty, and his body stopped twitching, and the wall behind him, sighed, a long, slow exhalation of the warm, sweetish air, and it released him. His body slumped forward and fell free of the stone and collapsed on the passage floor, emptied, finished. The wall closed behind where he had been, seamlessly, as though he had never been there. Six did not speak for the remainder of the descent. He did not speak for the remainder of the rotation. He has not, as of the writing of this entry, spoken to me since. We returned to the surface at 19th hour. I made my report, verbally to Taranth, because I no longer trusted the scribe servitor with written record. Taranth received the report in silence. His green oculars did not track while I spoke. When I finished, he said only, "Acknowledged, Logister. The Magos will be informed." The Magos was not informed. I checked. The report did not reach him. Taranth, in his own cold Skitarii calculus, had determined that the information was not useful to the Magos, or that the Magos no longer required information of that kind, and this is the possibility I have been unable to stop turning over in my mind, that Taranth himself was no longer certain which of the two remaining Skitarii in his honor guard were still wholly Skitarii, and was conserving sensitive information until the uncertainty resolved. Taranth, I should note, was among the latest sanctified of the Skitarii. He had time yet. Confessor Haust came to my barracks at 22nd hour. He did not knock. He opened the hatch. He staggered in. He was drunk. He reeked of sacramental amasec and vomit and something else. Something worse. Something that took me a long moment to identify, and which I identify now with a cold, dull certainty. He smelled of the shut-door wind, the warm, sweetish smell that came from the pylons. The smell had gotten into him. It was coming out of his pores. His sweat was the sweat of the tomb. He sat on my cot without asking. He pressed a sealed data crystal into my palm and closed my fingers around it, the way Verel had closed my fingers around the pendant. "Burn it," he said. "If you live, burn it. If you do not live, run. It does not matter which. Throne help us all, Sergeant. The Emperor is not listening in this place. I have been praying for 9 rotations, and he is not listening. He cannot hear us here. We are beneath something he does not reach." I asked him what was on the crystal. He said, "The previous expedition. The one that was lost. It was not lost, Sergeant. It completed its mission. And Ghrenn knows. Ghrenn has always known. He is not here to discover. He is here to finish." He stood. He walked to the hatch. He turned in the doorway. He looked at me for a long moment, and his face, the face of a man I had seen bless sanctified ground and consecrate lumens and weep privately into his censer when he thought no one was watching, was the face of a man who had already written himself out of the record of the living. He said, "Tell Veril I tried. Tell her the rites are too shallow for what they sealed beneath us. Tell her..." He stopped. He closed his eyes. He said, "Tell her I am sorry I was not strong enough." He walked out of my barracks. He walked past the perimeter auto-sentries. He walked beyond the lumen arrays of the command camp. He walked into the bone-grey dust and the curdled tallow light and the warm wind blowing from the pylons, and he did not turn back. And the perimeter cogitators did not record his departure, and he was gone. He did not return. I activated the data crystal. It was a recording from the previous Mechanicus expedition, 60 years ago. The Vox logs of a Magos explorator whose name had been redacted from every subsequent administratum reference to the Kheth-Varnak file, but whose voice on the recording identified himself as Magos Explorator Haven Vorik of the Forge World Styges 8. Vorik's final transmission, logged from 412 meters below the surface, in front of the doorway of molten script. His voice was calm. Calm in the way that Thol's voice had been calm, in the way that the voice on the Vox Thief recording had been calm. A doubled calmness. 2 voices agreeing with each other beneath a single vocal line. Vorik said, "Cohort log, final entry. The breach has been achieved. The entity designated in our private catalogue as the Quiet Below has been contacted. Communion is pleasant. It has requested that we remain. We have agreed. The cohort will not be returning to Styges 8. The cohort will be continuing its work from within. A follow-up expedition will be required in approximately 60 standard years. The entity has specified 60 years. It has specified the tonnage of flesh required. It has specified the number of unaugmented witnesses required. It has been very patient. It asks only that we prepare the way." A pause. Vorik's voice, the doubled voice, said, "The follow-up expedition will be led by one who has studied this recording. One who has spent his life petitioning for the dispensation to return. One who understands that the Mechanicus was built upon older bones than the Omnissiah. He is among you now, reviewing this recording. He has reviewed it many times. Greet him, Logister. Greet Magos Ghrenn, formerly discipulus of Magos Ghrenn, who watched his master ascend and has prepared his own ascension ever since. And then Vorik's voice said my full name, again, in my mother's inflection. Veyl Dren, thank you for bringing him. You were the final witness required. The tally is complete. The recording ended. I sat on my cot. I did not move. The data crystal in my hand was warm. The pendant in my other hand was warm. My barracks was warm. The warm wind was coming through a prefab that was sealed and pressurized, and should not have admitted any wind at all. And it was moving across the back of my neck, and it smelled of the shut door smell. And I understood finally, completely, what Haust had been unable to make himself say out loud. The Cohort had never been an expedition. The Cohort had been a delivery. Ghrenn had been the cultist all along. Ghrenn had spent 60 years arranging the dispensations, the writs, the personnel assignments, every signature on every slate that had brought us here. He had chosen Haust because Haust was a confessor he had calculated could be broken. He had chosen Varel because she was bright enough to understand and powerless enough to intervene. He had chosen Thol as a vessel for the thing to practice in. He had chosen the guardsmen, me, Six, Pala, Korik, all of us, because the thing in the tomb required unaugmented witnesses for its ascension, and guardsmen are the Imperium's endless supply of unaugmented witnesses, cheap and replaceable, and nobody asks where they go. The Magos was not going to be taken. The Magos was going to ascend. He was going to offer himself, and the thing below would accept him, and he would be remade in the pattern Vorik had already been remade in, and he would be the new mouth of the thing on the surface, and in 60 years another Magos, another discipulus of Ghrenn, watching now through some cogitator feed I had not detected, studying this recording already, preparing his own long, patient petition, would return with a fresh cohort and a fresh tithe of flesh, and the cycle would continue, and the thing below would eat its way upward through generation after generation of the Mechanicus, until, eventually, it reached the top. The Emperor is not listening in this place, Haust had said. The Emperor had never been listening in this place. I put down the data crystal. I put down the pendant. I picked up my stylus. I began to write. Because I am a logister. Because writing is what I do. Because the only thing left to me, now that I understood, was to leave a record so complete and so damning that if any soul at all, in any rotation of any century, should find this parchment, they would know. I wrote through the rest of the rotation. I wrote as the count beneath the carrier wave ticked towards 0. I wrote as Six, in the barracks next to mine, sat silent and unmoving in the dark, his 6-fingered left hand resting on his laser gun, and his right hand closed in a fist around something I did not ask about. I wrote as the warm wind grew warmer, and somewhere, 412 meters below, the figure at the base of the door took one more patient step, and the Magos, in his command tent, smiled his augmetic smile at the hololith of the doorway, and the count went tick and tick and tick. The betrayal is unveiled, traveler. Ghrenn is the door. The cohort is the key. The thing below is turning in the lock. The Emperor is not listening in this place. He never was. The field is thin now, traveler. The signal carries only because you are still listening. Mark this chronicle. Join the crew. Do not look away. The door is opening. Chapter 4. The Door That Was Never Shut. 8th rotation. The count is in the single digits. I went to the command tent at 4th hour with my laser gun armed. I did not go alone. Six came with me. He had still not spoken since the retrieval patrol, but when I stood from my cot and racked my weapon, he stood also, and he lifted his own, and his six-fingered left hand closed on the grip the way it had always closed, and I understood that he was with me in the way that mattered. Palla came. Korik came, white-faced, his Voxman's kit abandoned, carrying only a las pistol he did not know how to use properly. Adept Veyl was already in the tent when we arrived, standing before the hololith with her robes torn at the sleeve, and her eyes the eyes of a woman who had at last stopped pretending. Magos Ghrenn was not in the tent. He had already descended. Veyl told us, in a voice flat with the flatness of a cogitator reporting its own failure, that the Magos had ordered the final descent at third hour. He had taken the remaining 6 Skitarii, including Alpha Primus Taranth. He had taken 3 labor servitors. He had taken the sanctified crates the Cohort had been shipped here to fill. He had not taken any of the unaugmented priesthood. He had not taken Veyl. He had left her behind, Veyl said, with a small, dry smile that did not reach her eyes, because he no longer required her. The tally was complete. The witnesses had been brought to the shore. Ghrenn's last administrative act, before descending, had been to file a Cohort casualty report with the command cogitator, designating all unaugmented personnel, every guardsman, every auxiliary adept, confessor housed, Veyl herself, as lost in Cohort standard exploratory attrition. Bodies unrecoverable, file closed. The administratum would receive the report in due course. The administratum would not ask follow-up questions. The administratum never does. I looked at Veyl. I said, "We go after him." She said, "He wants you to." I said, "I know."
She said, "Then why?"
I said, "Because 6 Hecht has not spoken in 2 rotations, and I am not leaving this world without standing between my friend and whatever took his voice." Veyl looked at me for a long moment. Then she took her data slate, the one she had shown me the spiral stairwell on, the one I had lost and lost again, and she slung it across her shoulder, and she said, "Then I am coming also. Someone must translate the glyphs, and someone must witness what he becomes." We descended. The tunnel had changed. I know how this sounds. I record it anyway. The descent that had, on the previous rotation, taken us 31 minutes by the chrono took us, I do not know. The chrono would not hold a reading. The lumens were burning now in full reversed sequence, the bright ones at the bottom, the dark ones at the top, and the exhaled breath of the world was no longer exhaling. It was inhaling. The warm, sweetish air was moving past us in the opposite direction, drawing us downward, pulling at our coats and at the loose strands of Veyl's hair and at the sanctified ribbons on my pendant. Something below was breathing in. Preparing to speak, we reached the pillared hall at I do not know what hour. The cathedral was empty. The sarcophagi in their alcoves stood with their lids all slid aside now, every one of them, thousands of them, the dust around each disturbed in the pattern of a thing that had risen and walked away. The Necrons were out. The Necrons had been out for longer than anyone had known, and they had gone deeper, not up. They had gone to attend their old duty. They had gone to stand watch one last time at the door they had been trying to hold shut for 60 million years, and which was now, finally, being opened from the wrong side. I understood then. I write this down because the understanding was mine, and I will not let it be revised, that the metal dead of Kheth-Varnak were not our enemies. They were our colleagues, late, exhausted, defeated, but colleagues. We passed through the hall. We descended into the older passage. The grey porous stone breathed around us. The walls no longer pretended otherwise. The breathing was slow and deep, and entirely unlike the breathing of a resting animal. It was the breathing of something that had been holding itself motionless and was now, at last, permitted to move. Every 20 paces, a patch of the wall would sigh and open slightly. Not a door, not a mouth, just a slackening, the way a tired man's jaw slackens in his sleep. And something would be visible for a half-second behind the stone, and then the wall would tighten again, and whatever had been behind it would be gone. I did not look closely at what was behind the walls. Six did, once. He stopped walking. He stood in front of one of the slackening places, and he watched the thing behind the stone for perhaps 2 full seconds. When the wall closed, Six turned to me, and he opened his mouth, and for the first time in 2 rotations he spoke. He said one word. He said, "Mother." And then he kept walking. I did not ask him what he had seen. I did not want to know. I do not want to know now. We found the door at, by my best reckoning, somewhere around 57th hour of what was supposed to be the 8th rotation. The chrono had ceased reporting anything but a slow descending count that matched the pulse in my Vox bead. The count was at 4 when we reached the chamber. The chamber was vast. I use the word because I have no better word. It was larger than the pillared hall above it. Larger, perhaps, than the entire excavation we had cut into the surface. The ceiling was not visible. The walls were not visible. There was only the floor, which was the same grey porous stone as the passage, and at the far end of the floor, at a distance my eye refused to measure, there was the door. The door was as the Pict had shown it. The script was still flowing. The dust at its base had been disturbed for the last time, and the figure that had been curled there and had risen and had waited was no longer there. The figure was standing before the door now, facing it, with one hand pressed to the metal. Its other hand was extended behind it, palm open, in a gesture I understood with the horrible, instantaneous clarity of a man recognizing his own reflection. It was waiting to be handed something. Magos Ghrenn was walking toward it across the long floor. His 6 Skitarii flanked him in cruciform formation. Taranth was among them. Their radium carbines were lowered. Their oculars glowed their steady green. They were walking the Magos to the altar, the way a cardinal's honor guard walks him to his coronation. Ghrenn was carrying the sanctified crates. He was also, I record this because it is the detail I have been unable to forget, smiling. The Vox grill where his mouth had once been was not equipped to smile. He was smiling anyway. Something had reshaped the augmetic plating of his lower jaw, or the plating had reshaped itself in response to the something inside him, and the Magos was smiling as he walked, his ocular implant leaking oil in continuous slow drips, his mechadendrites arched in a posture of worshipful exultation. The figure at the door did not turn. It did not need to. It knew we were there. Its extended hand opened slightly, the fingers unfolding in a small, patient gesture, and Magos Ghrenn accelerated his pace, and one of the Skitarii, not Taranth, one of the younger ones, one of the late sanctified, raised his carbine and fired a single radium bolt into the back of Ghrenn's skull. The bolt struck true. Ghrenn's head jerked forward, and then his body kept walking. It kept walking for 4 more paces. His ocular implant had gone dark. His Vox grill had gone silent. A fist-sized hole wept oil and something else, something pale and silvery, like mercury mixed with milk, from the rear of his augmetic cranium, and his body kept walking, toward the door, toward the figure, its mechadendrites still arched in the same worshipful posture. The thing at the door had not been waiting for Ghrenn's soul. It had been waiting for his meat. The soul, such as the Magos had retained of one, was already digested. The body was the delivery. The Skitarii who had fired the shot lowered his carbine. He stood very still. Then, with a movement so precise and unhurried, it could only have been a final order, pre-committed to muscle memory. He turned his carbine and fired once into the head of the Skitarii to his left, who dropped, then into the Skitarii to his right, who also dropped. Then Alpha Primus Taranth raised his own radium weapon and fired 2 clean bolts into the final pair of his own brothers, and they fell. And Taranth and the young one stood alone in the cruciform's center. And Taranth's Vox grill emitted a Binharic phrase I did not need Veyl to translate. "Forgive this necessity, brother." The young Skitarii, the one who had fired the first shot, the one who had murdered his Magos and saved what little of the Mechanicus on this world could still be saved, nodded once. He spoke, in a voice almost human. It was going to become it, Alpha Primus. I watched it smile. Taranth said, "I know, brother." Then the thing at the door turned. I cannot describe it. My hand has tried. My hand has tried on this parchment for, I do not know how long. I have crossed out 7 attempts. Let me simply say, I could not see it. Not because it was hidden, because my eyes would not cooperate. The shape of it was a shape my optic nerve had no protocol for. When I tried to focus, my gaze slid away, to the door, to the dust, to the corpse of Ghrenn still walking, to anything else. When I forced my eyes back, my eyes reported what was there, but the report arrived in my mind as noise. A saturation, a sensory overflow the brain translates as pain.
What I can record is what my other senses told me.
The smell of ozone thickened until it tasted of blood on my tongue, and beneath it, the shut door smell was gone. The room smelled of an open door now, the smell of a chamber that had been closed for an epoch and was being aired for the first time. And the sound it made, when it turned, when it saw us, was a sound like a great chorus drowning in oil. Many voices, all singing the same note, all drowning in the same thick medium, all still managing to hit the note. The machine spirit of every piece of equipment we carried screamed. I felt my Vox bead burst, a wet pop against my eardrum. Veril's data slate flashed white and died. Six's laser gun shuddered in his hand and went cold. The lumen beams on our helmets guttered and held just barely. Taranth's radium carbine made a sound I had not known a carbine could make, a mournful Binharic keen. And then it fired of its own accord, once, into the stone at the Alpha Primus's feet, and went silent forever. The young Skitarii stepped forward. He did not raise his weapon. He did not need to. He walked past Taranth, toward the thing at the door, and as he walked, he unslung his omniscient axe from his back, and he activated the power core of the axe to its maximum overload setting. And Veyl, who could translate Binharic and knew what the keening pitch of an overloading power core meant, grabbed my arm and pulled. We ran. Taranth ran with us for 3 strides. Then he stopped. Then he turned, and he fell in behind the young Skitarii, and he added his own carbine's power core to the overload, and the 2 of them walked together, calmly, slowly, brothers at a consecration, toward the thing at the door, while Veyl and Six and Palla and Kheth and I ran for the passage. The detonation reached us in the tunnel. It was not a sound. It was a pressure, a sudden thick wall of silence so complete, it scraped the thought out of my skull for some number of seconds I cannot account for. When I could think again, I was running, and Six was running beside me, and Veyl was ahead, and Kheth was stumbling, and Palla was not there. I do not know when she fell. I do not know if it was the detonation or something else. I know only that we reached the passage, and she did not, and I turned to look, and Veyl grabbed my collar and pulled me onward, and her face was streaked with tears, and she was screaming at me in a high Gothic dialect I did not know she could speak, and the passage was collapsing behind us. The breathing walls were clenching, the whole structure spasming shut like a dying throat. and I ran. We left Pala. I am writing this down because I will not let it be softened in any later revision. I left her and I ran. We reached the pillared hall. The cathedral was no longer empty. The Necron sarcophagi stood open still, but their occupants had returned, thousands of them. Rank on rank, lining the aisle, standing silent in the posture of old soldiers at a funeral. The green trickle of power in their necrodermis was faint. They were exhausted. They had come up from below, from the deeper door, and they had stopped here because they could go no further, because 60 million years of vigil had used them up. They did not attack us. They watched us pass. One of them, taller than the others, crowned, its gauntlet resting on the pommel of a staff, inclined its head as I ran past it. A fractional gesture. Acknowledgement. Perhaps gratitude. Perhaps neither. Perhaps only the old motion of a thing that remembered, dimly, how living creatures courtesied to one another before the long sleep. I did not stop. I understood later what it had been saying. It had been saying, "We tried. We failed. You will fail also. But we saw you try, and we mark it." Six stayed at the cathedral's far threshold. He stopped running. He turned. He looked at me. He raised his laser gun, cold, drained, useless, and he smiled his old smile, the one I had not seen since the first rotation, and he said, in a voice perfectly clear, perfectly his own, "Go on, Veyl. I want to see what comes up the aisle." I said his name. He said, "Go." I went. I do not know what came up the aisle. I know only that as I was running the last 100 meters to the tunnel ingress, I heard Six laugh. Once. His old laugh. The laugh he had laughed on Kashan when we survived the shrine. The laugh he had laughed over ration loaves when the new recruits arrived. The laugh of a man who had looked at the worst the galaxy could put in front of him and decided against all reason to find it funny. Then the laugh stopped. Then a voice, not his, said something in a tone I do not record. Then the tunnel shook, and I ran. We reached the surface at... There is no hour. The chrono has stopped. There is only after. The landing barges were still there. Lander Primus, Lander Secundus. The Umbra Laudatum was not. The orbital feed showed nothing in geosync where the ship should have been. Veril at the command tent's cogitator pulled up the last orbital log. The Umbra Laudatum had broken orbit at 6th hour of the 8th rotation. No warning, no hail. It had simply burned for the system's Mandeville point at maximum thrust and had translated into the warp as soon as it was clear of the gravity well. It had run, or it had been warned to run, by something below that did not want witnesses leaving, except on its own terms. Korik was laughing quietly, not from humor. He was standing at the command tent's entrance, looking out at the bone-grey dust and the curdled sun, and he was laughing in a small, steady rhythm. 2 beats, pause, 2 beats, pause. And I put my hand on his shoulder, and he did not react. Veril said, "We take the barge. We translate. We burn a warning to the nearest astropathic relay. We tell the Imperium." I said, "We tell them what?" "That the Mechanicus is compromised 60 generations deep. That the door is open." She said, "We tell them something. We tell them anything. We do not die here in silence." I looked at Korik. I looked at Veril. I looked at my own hands. I said, "Yes, we go." We boarded Lander Secundus. I did the pre-flight. The engines answered. The machine spirit of the lander was, against all reason, intact, or something in it had chosen to answer, because something in it wanted us to leave with the thing it had given us. We lifted. We broke atmosphere. We burned for the warp translation zone. I looked at Korik and the crash webbing across from me. He had stopped laughing. He pulled off his helmet, slowly, gratefully. He was crying a little and smiling, and he turned to me and he said, "Throne, Sergeant. We made it. I thought we..." The face above his collar was not Corric's face. It was the right general shape. The features were approximately correct, but the proportions were subtly wrong. The eyes a fraction too far apart, the jaw a fraction too long, the mouth smiling in a shape Corric's mouth had never made. It was the face of something that had been issued Corric's face as a costume and had not yet learned to wear it precisely. I looked at Veyl. Her face was not hers either. I looked at my own reflection in the dark viewport beside my seat. I could not remember, I realized, the last time I had looked at my own reflection. I could not remember what my own face looked like. I was trying to picture it, and I was picturing instead the thing that had stood at the door and the patient extended hand. I put my hand to my cheek. The skin moved slightly under my fingers, the way a costume moves. The lander burned on toward the translation point. The count in my Vox bead, the Vox bead I no longer remembered still being in my ear, went tick, tick, tick. The door is open, traveler. The ascension is complete. Ghrenn has been consumed. 6 have been left behind. Pallor is in the dark. The Necrons have done what they could, and it was not enough. And on the lander burning for the translation point, 3 faces that are not faces are returning to the Imperium as witnesses. The Emperor is not listening. Something else is. Chapter 5. The Vox-Journal of a Dead Man. I do not know where I am. I know the walls are white. I know the lumen strip overhead burns steady, not sputtering, not counting, not falling into the 2-beat rhythm I have been listening to for a long time, I know. There is a chrono mounted above the hatch, and the chrono reports a date 3 weeks after my last parchment entry on Kheth-Varnak. And I know that 3 weeks is not a duration I remember living through. I am in a medici cell. A sister hospitaller of the Order of the Sacred Rose attended me an hour ago. She was kind. Her voice was kind. Her hands were cool when she took my pulse. She informed me, in the gentle cadence the Order reserves for the recovered and the broken, that I had been rescued. The Imperial Navy frigate Sword of Remembrance, on patrol at the edge of the Ghoul Stars, had intercepted a drifting landing barge in the warp translation zone outside the Kheth-Varnak system. The barge had been adrift for 11 days. It contained 1 living soul, me. No Adept Veyl, no Guardsman Corric, no bodies, no equipment crates, no flight log. The barge's cogitator had been wiped. The barge's Vox bead logs had been purged. The only thing aboard was a Cadian Logister-Sergeant, unconscious in the crash webbing of the pilot's seat, clutching a parchment journal to his chest and screaming a name into a dead Vox. The name, the sister told me with delicate care, of a friend perhaps, Sergeant. You were calling for someone named Hecht. I was calling for 6. I had been calling for 6 for 11 days. The sister smiled sadly. She told me that according to my service file, Sergeant Hecht had died 4 years ago, during the Kashan reclamation, the Shrine of the 12. I told her that was a lie. She said gently, "Sergeant, you were assigned to a supply convoy. The convoy was lost in warp transit. You were the sole survivor. You were recovered from the drifting barge, and you have been recovering ever since. There was no expedition. There was no Magos Ghrenn. There was no Tombworld. I am sorry. I am so very sorry. The mind does this. The warp does this. It gives us the friends we have already lost."
I listened to her.
I watched her lips move. I noticed that her lips moved in a rhythm of 2, pause, 2, pause. I did not tell her I noticed. The confessor came to counsel me on the second day. He was a gentle old man with a cataract-clouded eye and an aquila pendant that he clutched as he spoke. He was kind also. Everyone on this ship is kind. The Sword of Remembrance is a kind ship. It is full of kind faces, kind voices, kind hands that adjust the blankets on my cot with a practiced tenderness I find, for reasons I do not want to examine, deeply distressing. The confessor prayed over me. His litany was the litany of the recovered mind. I knew it. I had heard it once before, years ago, delivered over a guardsman who had come back from a warp incursion, convinced that his own reflection was pursuing him. That guardsman had hanged himself in the medici cell 2 rotations later. I did not tell the confessor this. When he finished the litany, he took my hand in both of his, and he said to me in his gentle voice, "Sergeant Dren, the things you remember are not real. Say it with me." I did not say it with him. He said, "Please, my son, the healing begins with acknowledgement." I said, "What about Veyl's data slate?" He blinked his cataract-clouded eye. He said, "Whose slate, Sergeant?" I said, "Adept Discipulus Iona Veyl." She pressed a slate into my hand. It had the map of Sepulchre Prime, the stairwell that redrew itself. She would have been recovered with me. Where is she? The confessor was quiet for a long moment. He said, "Sergeant, there was no such adept. There is no such slate. You were alone in the barge. You have always been alone." And I understood then that the kind Sister Hospitaller and the kind old confessor and the kind crew of the kind frigate Sword of Remembrance were not lying to me. They believed what they were saying. Something had made them believe. I began to notice the wrongnesses on the third day. They were small. They were the kind of wrongnesses that would not register to anyone who had not spent 8 rotations on the bone-grey shore of Kheth-Varnak, learning to recognize the pattern. A servo skull in the corridor outside my medici cell drifted past at 6th hour, trailing a low Binharic litany. The litany trailed off mid-phrase, and the skull paused in the air, and it hovered there for some indefinite number of seconds before its litany resumed, and it drifted on. A tech adept attached to the frigate's medici deck came to recalibrate the monitoring auspex beside my cot. The auspex was cycling through a diagnostic routine that included, as its final stage, a self-generated map of the room for spatial calibration purposes. I watched the map render. The cell was rendered. The hatch was rendered. The corridor beyond the hatch was rendered. A stairwell was rendered. The stairwell descended from a point in the corridor that I had, in 3 days of careful observation, confirmed was a flat stretch of decking. The stairwell was drawn in the crisp green line of an auspex-confirmed architectural feature. It spiraled downward in a pattern of uneven turns. I tried to count the turns. I kept losing count. The first count, 11. The second, 17. The third. The tech adept finished his recalibration. The map blanked. He did not mention the stairwell. I do not know if he saw it. I do not know if he could have seen it, if the stairwell was a thing visible to any eye other than mine. The eye that had already counted spirals once before, and had therefore, I understood with a cold, dull certainty, given something the shape of my attention to use as a template. At 8th hour, the air recycler in my cell emitted a slow, patient exhalation that smelled of a shut door. The smell lasted 4 seconds. Then the recycler resumed its ordinary hum. I lay on the medici cot, and I listened to the ordinary hum, and I understood. I understood slowly. That is the cruelty of it. The understanding did not come as a revelation. It came as an accumulation, small wrongnesses, patient wrongnesses, the steady accretion of a rhythm that had followed me off Kheth-Varnak, the way the smell of the shut door had followed Houst out of the tomb and into his own sweat. The thing in the sepulchre had not been a body. I understood this on the fourth day. The body was only the last shape it had chosen to wear. The Pict had captured the body because a Pict captures what photons can be convinced to carry, and photons had been convinced 60 years ago to carry the image of something curled in dust. But the thing itself, the thing beneath the door, the thing the Necrons had spent 60 million years standing guard over, had not been a body. It had been an attention, a gaze. The way a predator is a gaze before it is a body, the way a hunter is an attention to quarry before he is a hunter. The door of molten script had not been sealing a creature in a chamber. The door had been the focusing lens of a regard, narrowing a vast hungry awareness down into a single point that could be locked behind a single metal surface. And the Necrons had stood sentry at that door, not to keep a monster in, but to keep the attention from spreading. Every time a witness approached the door, the attention climbed a little further up the witness's nerves. Every time a witness returned to the surface, the attention rode back with them. The Mechanicus had sent Vorik 60 years ago. Vorik had become a mouth for it. Vorik had summoned Ghrenn. Ghrenn had become another mouth. Ghrenn had summoned a cohort. The cohort had been eaten, or worn out, which is perhaps the more accurate formulation, because I do not think the thing kills in any sense the Imperium would recognize. I think the thing wears a shape until it is done wearing that shape, and then sets the shape down. The shape does not stop walking when the wearer sets it down.
The shape is the record of having been worn.
I am writing this down because I was a witness. I went to the door. I did not cross the threshold. I did not lay my palm against the molten script, but I saw it. I saw it with my own eyes, and my own eyes reported what they saw, and the report arrived in my brain as noise, a sensory overflow. And noise, I understand now, is the shape attention takes when it cannot fit through the channel the eye provides. Some of the attention got through anyway. It is with me now. It has been with me since I looked. Veyl was real. Korik was real. 6 Hect was real. I am writing their names here because writing their names is the last gift I can give them, and because I am afraid, I am very afraid, that in another few days I will no longer be able to remember that they were real. The revisions have already begun. My parchment journal, the one the sister hospitaller assures me I was clutching when they recovered me, the one that is now on the small shelf above my medici cot, the one I am writing this entry in, has begun to change overnight. The early entries are intact. Arrival, the footprints in the dust, the first briefing. The later entries have been softened. The sentences still say what they said. The names are still the names, but the emphasis has been altered. Passages I underlined 3 times in a shaking hand are now underlined once. Passages that read, in my original writing, as frantic warnings, now read as the tired observations of a tired man noting interesting phenomena at a routine dig. The handwriting is still mine. The ink is still mine. I am rewriting my own journal in my sleep, and I do not remember doing it. And each morning when I wake, the version on the page is a little kinder to itself, a little more composed, a little more consistent with the version of events the kind confessor and the kind sister have been patiently explaining to me. I know what this is. I recognize it. The thing in the sepulchre is not rewriting my journal. The thing in the sepulchre is rewriting me, and my hand is simply producing the journal that the new me would have written. I understood the full shape of it on the 6th day. I was looking at the chrono above the hatch. The chrono was steady. The chrono reported Imperial Standard Time, synchronized to the Sword of Remembrance's astropathic relay, accurate to within 1/100th of a second per cycle. The chrono ticked. It ticked in a rhythm of 2, pause, 2, pause. And I realized, with the slow, dull, descending clarity that I have come to recognize as my mind's only remaining honest faculty, that the rhythm had not followed me out of Kheth-Varnak. The rhythm had always been there. The chrono on the Sword of Remembrance had been ticking in 2-beat rhythm since before I arrived aboard. It had been ticking that way since before the frigate intercepted my barge. It had, in all probability, been ticking that way since the frigate was commissioned, since the Imperium was founded, since the first Imperial cogitator was sanctified and set to count the seconds of the realm. The rhythm had not spread outward from the tomb. The rhythm had always been the baseline. The silence between the beats was the anomaly. The silence between the beats was what the Necrons had been holding in place for 60 million years. The silence between the beats was the door, and the door had been every silence, in every held breath, in every waiting moment, in every corner of the galaxy. And the Necrons had stood guard over the silences, because they had understood, in whatever long, tired Xeno's way, they understood anything. That the silences were where the thing could be stopped from listening. The silences were closing. On the Sword of Remembrance, in the Imperium, in the warp itself. The attention had been locked behind a door on Kheth-Varnak, because the door had been the last silence the Necrons had been able to maintain. And when we opened the door, the silence ended, and the thing that had been regarding the galaxy through a narrow, focused aperture now regarded it through every aperture at once. And the count, the patient 2-beat count beneath every chrono, and every heart, and every dying lumen in every corner of the Imperium, was no longer a countdown to something. It was a count, a tally. The thing was counting. It was counting witnesses. And I understood, finally, the last cruelty, the last private humiliation the thing had arranged for me, because the count did not care whether the witnesses had seen the door directly. The count only required that they understood there was a door. The count only required that the concept be passed, successfully, from one aware mind to another. Every soul who understood the story became a new witness. Every new witness was a new silence ending, somewhere in the galaxy. The following portion of the entry was written in a hand that the Mechanicus' Auspex confirms is Sergeant Dren's, but in a rhythm and cadence that several independent Mechanicus adepts have flagged as non-compliant with his prior linguistic patterns. The distinction is noted in the archival record. It is marked for review. The review has not been scheduled. I am going to end this recording. I am going to end it honestly. I am not going to soften it in the night. I am going to fix this entry in place, on parchment, with a stylus, and I am going to seal the journal, and I am going to tell the Sister Hospitaller that I require sanctified cleansing, and when she administers the sanctified cleansing, I am going to take the opportunity she will not know she is giving me, and I am going to stop being a witness. That is the only thing a witness can still do. A witness can stop. I do not know if stopping helps. I do not know if the attention releases a witness who has stopped witnessing, or whether, and this is the fear I cannot write down any more plainly than this, whether a stopped witness is simply a finished meal, whose shape the attention has been waiting to set down so that it can move on to the next wearer. Either way, traveler, and I am speaking to you now. Whoever you are, whoever has found this recording in whatever recovered data slate the Sword of Remembrance eventually logs and files and forgets. Either way, I cannot be the one who hands the count another witness, which is why I am warning you. Stop listening. Stop now. I understand that you will not. I understand that you are the kind of soul who listens to the end of a thing once you have started it, Because that is the shape a mind takes in the grim darkness of the far future, when the Imperium has trained us all to consume every propaganda pict and every sanctioned chronicle in full, because incomplete witnessing is a heresy of inattention. I understand. I forgave you the moment I started recording. But understand this. In return, the moment you finish this entry, you are a witness. The moment you understand the pattern I am describing, the door, the attention, the count, the 2-beat rhythm in every chrono, the silence between the beats that is no longer held. The thing in the sepulchre has one more silence to close, and it will close it, patiently. The way it closed 60 years of Mechanicus dispensation petitions into Ghrenn's single-signed writ. The way it closed 6 Hect's laugh into a voice that was not his. The way it closed my own face into whatever face I am wearing now, sitting in this cell, which I have not dared look at in a mirror since the 4th day because I am afraid of what I will find and more afraid of what I will not find. I can give you only one piece of advice, traveler. It is the same advice Confessor Haust gave me on the bone-grey shore, the advice I did not take, the advice that is the only honest advice any Imperial soul can give another Imperial soul in the age we live in. The Emperor is not listening in this place. He cannot hear you here. You are beneath something he does not reach. Make your peace with this, quickly, while the silence between your own heartbeats is still your own. 6 joked, once, on the first rotation, that the world felt like a cathedral somebody forgot to finish building. He was wrong. The architects never left. They never stopped building. They simply paused their work when the Necrons locked the door, and they waited, patient as all truly old things are patient, for the door to be opened from the wrong side. And when it opened, they resumed their work. They are building now, through Ghrenn, through Vorik, through me, through the Sister Hospitaller who smiles her kind smile and does not know that her chrono ticks in 2-beat rhythm, through the Confessor whose Litany of the Recovered Mind is now, by subtle small revisions, a slightly different litany than the one he learned at seminary, though he cannot say when it changed. They are building through the listener. They are building through you. I am sorry. I am so sorry, traveler. I did not want this for you. But I was a logister. Writing things down was my purpose, and the purpose of a record is to be read, and the purpose of a recording is to be heard, and the shape of an unrecorded record is a silence, and silences are the one thing the thing beneath Kheth-Varnak cannot tolerate. So here is my record. Here is my recording. Here is the door, handed to you, in the shape of a story. There are footsteps in the corridor outside my cell. I have been listening to them for a duration. I do not know how long. They started in the middle of this entry, and I have been writing around them, and they are still coming. They match my boots perfectly. They were laid down before I arrived. I set down the stylus now. I close the journal. I seal it. I put it on the shelf above my cot. When they find it, if they find it, if the sanctified cleansing goes the way I intend it to go, if the sister's kind hand is steady, they will find this entry, and they will transcribe it, and they will archive it, and they will mark it Vermillion-Obscura, and file it in the deep stacks of the Ordo Xenos, and it will be lost. And someone eventually will find it, and that someone will listen, and the count somewhere very quiet will tick forward by 1. I am sorry. I tried. The footsteps are at the hatch. I am going to open it now. The Emperor protects. Probably. Usually. Not here, not anymore, not ever. The data slate is closed, Traveler of the Void. The Chronicle of Logister-Sergeant Veyl Dren is complete. But you and I both know now that completion is not the same thing as ending. The archivists of Voidborn Terrors offer no benediction for this one. There is no Emperor's blessing to send you back into the dark. There is only the transmission and the fact of your having received it, and the small patient silence that has opened somewhere in your chest that was not there before you began listening. If you would offer a tithe to the archives, the YouTube gift link remains below, though we suspect, at this point, your attention is a more valuable currency than your coin. Mark the chronicle with your approval. Join the crew. Subscribe for the next transmission. We have others. We have many others. The void is long, and there are many doors. Until the next signal, traveler, listen for the silence between the beats. While you still can, the Emperor protects. Something else also watches.